No, you're fine.
All right, it is going to be live in about 15 seconds.
Good morning. Welcome to the Recalibration Committee, first meeting for 2020. My name is Dave Kinski. I'll be chairing on the Senate side. My co-chairman is Representative Summers. I'll be chairing today's meeting. Albert will be chairing tomorrow's meeting. Just to kind of briefly go through what we're going to do before we get into the presentations. I want to also welcome, in addition to the recalibration members, the members of the Joint Education Interim Committee, members of the public, and a big thank you to staff for all their Herculean efforts in getting the materials put together for this meeting. The first order of business is opening comments by the chairs. I'm going to defer to Albert to go ahead and open with his comments. My comments are going to be limited purely to just the process for the day. Then we'll turn our attention to the rules, and then we'll get started with the presentation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Co-Chairman Summers for opening comments.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Did you want to take roll first, or shall I provide some comments and then we take roll? What's your preference?
Let's go ahead and take roll. Good catch. Thank you.
Senator Bebout.
Here.
Senator Coe.
Here.
Senator Hicks.
Present.
Senator Cost.
Here.
Senator Rothfuss.
Here.
Representative Barlow.
Present.
Representative Connolly.
Here.
Representative Harshman.
Excused.
Representative Nicholas.
Here.
Representative Schwartz.
Here.
Co-Chairman Summers.
Here.
And Co-Chairman Kinski.
Here.
We have a quorum.
All right, Albert, you're fire away.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I guess, first of all, I just want to welcome everyone. And I want to assure the committees and the public that we will allow for robust dialogue between the committees and robust public comment. We're working on ways to provide more public comment opportunities as we move through these meetings. Recalibration of the K-12 funding model is a process to ensure the legislature is providing a cost-based funding model provides an adequate and equitable education for every child in Wyoming. Due to the historic projected drop in state revenues resulting from the current pandemic, I'm sure we'll have some great debates. As chairs, we will ensure these debates are respectful to each other and to the stakeholders. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Co-Chairman Summers. So my comments are these, and it's just process. We have a lot of important background material. My focus is going to be just keeping us on time and on track. With respect to questions and comments, Co-Chairman Summers and I have visited with staff, and I think the committee will find this acceptable. We're asking each committee member to hold their questions until the end of each presentation. On the longer presentations, such as the Picus and Auden presentation, they've been asked to break their presentation up into logical break points where they will pause and open it up for questions. So at the end of each presentation, or at appropriate breaks in the longer presentations, we'll have questions first from the Recalibration Committee members, second from the Joint Education Interim Committee members, and then we would welcome comments from the public. We'd ask that those comments be germane to the presentation or the portion of the presentation that was just heard. And then public comment, as Representative Summers mentioned, it's important under these Zoom rules. We asked everybody to have their comments in by their request for comments in by 3:30 as of yesterday. But we're both concerned that that may be unduly restrictive. So if you find there's a portion or a presentation as a member of the public that you'd like to offer comment, please email Karen Vaughn at wyoledge.gov. That's Karen.vaughn@wyoleg.gov. and she'll advise myself and Co-Chairman Summers of your request, and we'll determine where best to fit you into the flow of things for the day. The final process concerns requests by committee members, whether Recalibration Committee or Education Committee, for follow-up information from staff or follow-up information from the consultants. I've asked Mr. Wilmark to keep a track of those requests and who's made the requests, and then periodically we'll recap those. And the reason we want to do that procedure is that we've been admonished by leadership as well as advised by LSO that the workloads are pretty stupendous at this point. And so we want to make sure that a request for information seems as compelling at 3 o'clock on Wednesday as it does at 9 a.m. on Wednesday. I don't know about you all, but things that I believe are important. When later I hear the recap, a number of those requests I go ahead and drop off, either because the questions have been answered or they don't seem as important as at the time that I made them. So to recap, we're going to go through the presentation, then we'll have questions from Recalibration, Education Committee, questions, public comment, and then move on to the next portion of the presentation. So with that, I'm going to open it up for rules. We have an appendix of the standard rules. And
Mr. Chairman, you have Senator Bebout had a question.
Senator Bebout.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to be helpful for everybody, including the public participating, when we start each part of our agenda, if you would refer to the details in terms of our appendix, which one we're working off of, I think that'll help everybody. And then as I understand it, when we do like the background on prior recalibration, you want to wait, have the members of this committee wait till the end to ask our questions. Am I correct?
Mr. Chairman, yes, I won't cut anybody off, but I'd sure like for us to be able to get through the materials, hold the questions to the end and get those all at once, because the questions are coming not just from the Recalibration Committee, but also from the Joint Education Committee. And I understand there may be points where, people really feel like they've got to ask a question mid-presentation, but I'd ask, see if we can try that and see how it works.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I get that, and then you'll announce each part of our appendix as we go into it. Thank you.
And Mr. Chairman, just could we check to make sure that members of the Education Committee have been let in? I have a message from someone who is waiting to be let into the meeting.
Josh or Matthew, I have a message on my screen. 2 people have entered the waiting room. I leave it to you or Karen or somebody to manage the waiting room. You're not expecting me to manage that, are you?
Mr. Chairman, Karen and myself will manage that for you. We have one person for public comment, then we have one person with a 6-digit ID, and I don't know if that's a Joint Education Committee member or not, so we have not admitted that person.
Mr. Chairman, my guess is that that's Representative Freeman. He often joins meetings with the 6-digit number.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Representative Connolly. With that, let's turn our attention to the rules. You have an email from staff with the standard interim committee rules. I'll ask for a motion and second, and then we can discuss them and see if there's any proposed amendments to the rules for recalibration.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Mr. Chairman, I would move that the committee adopt the sample interim committee rules as the rules of the select committee with the following amendments. All references to chairman and vice chairman be changed to co-chairman pursuant to 2020 House Enrolled Act 96, which requires this committee to have co-chairman, and 2, a vote to approve a bill for sponsorship by the committee shall require passage by a majority of each house. That's my motion, Mr.
Thank you. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a motion and a second. I didn't catch who the second was by. I assume staff got that. Barlow. Discussion or amendments?
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, just briefly, I do believe that a bill that's sponsored, we do need to have a majority by each side, or there's really no point of bringing the bill. So that's the reason for that. So thank you, Mr.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion or amendments on the rules? So with that, not hearing any amendments, I will just advise the committee. Representative Summers and I talked at length about the vote that would be required for amendments. That's just a majority of the committee, but with the understanding that if there's a majority of either the House or the Senate that does not support a particular amendment, we're asking staff to keep track of those because, you know, enough of those things where we don't have a majority of either side, it may raise a question as to whether we can get a bill out of committee, or if we get a bill out of committee, whether it can make it through one house or the other unscathed. So staff will be keeping track of any amendments where there was not a majority of either the House or the Senate. So with that, if there's no further discussion or amendments, I'll call for the question on the amendment. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Raise your hand.
Or raise your hand.
Yeah, why don't you do a roll call vote?
All right. Let's do a roll call.
Senator Bebout,
Aye.
Senator Coe,
Aye.
Senator Hicks,
Aye.
Senator Cost,
Aye.
Senator Rothfuss,
Aye.
Representative Barlow,
Aye.
Representative Connolly,
Aye.
Representative Harshman,
Aye.
Representative Nicholas, Representative Nicholas,
Aye.
Representative Schwartz,
Aye.
Co-Chairman Summers,
Aye.
and Co-Chairman Kinski.
Aye.
That's passed.
That amendment passed. Now with respect to the rules, Senator Bebout, do you want a roll call on the rules or just a show of hands?
I think, Mr. Co-Chair, excuse me, you know, just do a roll call. That way it's clear.
All right, thank you. Roll call, a question on the rules
Mr. Chairman,
as amended.
point of
Yeah.
order.
Yes.
The motion was an integrated motion, so all of the amendments were present as part of the original motion. That motion is
Correct.
carried, so the business is concluded.
All right, thank you. Well, and we're off to a great start. It's 8:46. We're now at 8:45 item on the agenda. Background on prior recalibration efforts in school finance litigation. So with that, I'll turn it over to staff members, Matt Wilmarth and Josh Anderson.
Good morning,
And
Mr. Chairman.
the indices that we're working on now are in the packet. It's titled Prior Recalibration Efforts in Litigation. And then there's a memorandum from Josh Anderson dated June 18, 2020.
And Mr. Chairman, for the materials index, that's item 2-01. The memorandum you referenced was not included on our website. I'll get into the presentation here. Let me share my screen. So, Mr. Chairman, this is a just kind of a brief walkthrough of some of the previous efforts, kind of how we got here, and what we're doing, and some of the court decisions that inform this process. So just brief summary of what this presentation is going to be. We're going to have a timeline of this process, some of the court mandates, and then the legislative response. So looking at the timeline here, you'll see the first major case was in 1980, the Washakie decision. Then 95, we had Campbell 1. 1997, we had first recalibration, or really the first time that the legislature used a consultant to create the school finance model. Then in 2001, there was the Campbell 2 and Campbell 3 decisions. There was another recalibration in 2001, another recalibration in 2005, and then the final court decision was in 2008, Campbell 4, and then several recalibrations following that, ending with our current effort in the 2020 recalibration. Just briefly before I get into the Washakie case, before that, there was an earlier decision, 1971, the Hinkle decision, that kind of introduced the idea of equalizing ad valorem taxes across the state to pay for education. Didn't get into a lot of the other deep constitutional questions, or didn't overall declare the system unconstitutional. But that kind of informed then the 1980 decision, Washakie. At that time, there was a school foundation program that provided financial assistance to the school districts. However, the court declared that system unconstitutional under equal protection due to wealth-based disparities. The court spent a significant amount of time in that case discussing the variable amount of funds that were available to each of the different school districts across the state and the wide disparity. The court there declared education as a fundamental right and noted that it was the responsibility of the legislature to provide for the school system and finance it. It's also the first case where the court started talking about strict scrutiny in relation to these cases, which of course means that if the court wanted to, or if the legislature wanted to have wealth-based disparity, it would be necessary to achieve a compelling state interest, and there'd be no less onerous alternative. Following the Washakie decision, then the legislature revised the funding model. They mandated a 25 mil local levy, a 12 mil state levy, 6 mil county levy, and then there was also an optional 6 mil levy. There was also a constitutional change, which will be talked about in the next slide, to allow for some recapture of funds. This funding model was adopted in 1983 following Washakie. It was indicated that it was going to be a transitional system until a further study could be completed, but that was not then later updated. So then in 1995 was the Campbell 1 decision. The court said that the legislature is required to define and specify what a proper education is for a Wyoming child. The court noted that at the time, there was a potential for 49 autonomous education systems across the state. And so they spent a lot of time talking about the requirement for a statewide educational program, requiring the legislature to establish and maintain a complete and uniform system of public instruction that will equip students for their future roles. Those roles were as citizens, participants in the political system, and competitors both economically and intellectually. One important thing I left off of this slide is that the court in this case required the legislature to conduct a cost of education study to develop a new funding system. And that's when the legislature first hired consultants and developed their next funding system. The court said that the cost of the educational package shall be determined by the legislature and then funded. Following Washakie, then I noted on the previous page, the legislature adopted a constitutional amendment to allow for the school district to allow for a school district levy and to allow the state to recapture a portion of that levy. The Constitution was also amended to reduce the number of county mills from 12 to 6. And Article 15, Section 15 of the Constitution was amended to increase the state mills from 6 to 12. And then following Campbell 1, the legislature hired a consultant to determine costs and developed the first funding model for a cost-based system to fund schools. And then in 2001, got the Campbell 2 decision. Court found that the cost-based model approach chosen by the legislature was capable of funding or supporting a constitutional school finance system. They did note several issues with different elements in the model, including maintenance and operations, at-risk students, small school and small district adjustments, and the regional cost adjustment. In this case, the court also noted requirements that the model be recalibrated in 2001 and then thereafter at least every 5 years, and that an external cost adjustment be applied to the model at least every 2 years to keep the costs of the model current. Next legislative response, there was a recalibration of the model in 2001 and again in 2005. In 2005, that recalibration changed from the previous model, sometimes known as the MAP model, to our current framework. Large portion of that change was providing more transparency within the model. Also, over that time period, then the legislature did adopt a number of external cost adjustments and also required recalibration by law, not less than every 5 years. Quick note here then, the Campbell 3 decision, not included in the slide packet, that was primarily related to capital construction. And while that is part of the overall school system, the legislature has historically separated capital construction and the rest of the school finance system, and that's not generally contemplated in recalibration. Then finally, then, Mr. Chairman, 2008 Campbell 4 decision, the court found that the legislature has in place a thorough and efficient educational structure funded from state wealth as required by the state constitution. They held that the recalibration that was conducted in 2001 had met the requirements of Campbell 2. They specified the one change outstanding at the end of Campbell 4 was that the regional cost adjustment should not be used to go below statewide costs. So that would be a floor, but the model is a floor and you can't go under that. And then the court released jurisdiction of the case. There were a couple other outstanding issues, mostly related to capital construction at the end of the Campbell 4 decision. And with that, Mr. Chairman, take any questions.
Questions from the Recalibration Committee, Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I bumped off just for a second, Josh, but I had a question and maybe you answered it. In the Washakie in your slide, and I've always wondered this and never really asked because I'm not a lawyer. It said in your slide that education is a fundamental right. What is that? What does a fundamental right mean?
Mr. Chairman, excellent question. I mean, so a fundamental right is simply, something that can't be taken away without due process. So I mean, it provides a heightened standard of review if there's any limitations imposed on that right.
Senator Bebout, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As to that fundamental right, the one question I had, I was going to mention that Mr. Co-Chair brought it up, but as to the fundamental right, is there anything nationwide or nationally that relates to that? Any other cases that talks about a fundamental right relative to education? And then the other question is about the mill levy issue, but first, if you would answer that first question, Mr. Co-Chair.
Sure. Mr. Chairman, Senator Bebout, there are other states that have recognized the fundamental right for education. It has not been recognized on the national level, so there's not a U.S. constitutional right, but state by state, they've recognized it in their constitution as Wyoming has.
And Mr. Co-Chair, a follow-up to that, are there any other states, I mean, how many have recognized it as a fundamental right? And I don't think any state has denied it, at least I couldn't find that. Do we know how many have declared it a fundamental right?
Josh?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know that specifically. The court cited, especially in the Washakie decision, a number of other states at that time that had recognized it, but also noted that there were a couple that at least didn't require a statewide funding system, but they rejected that line of cases. So there were, at least at that time, some states that had gone the other direction, but that Wyoming followed the number of states that had gone in the same manner and required it to be funded through state wealth.
Thank you. Representative Connolly has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just following up on the fundamental right discussion. Josh, would it be fair to say that because education is a fundamental right, and honestly, my look is that while the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution declares education a right, there are very few states, if any, other than Wyoming, that declare it a fundamental right. That what that means is that there needs to be that highest level of review, strict scrutiny, as opposed to a rational basis review for any type of discussion regarding education, because it is a fundamental right.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's fair. In the Campbell 4 decision, the court did, use rational basis to review certain portions. So I think strict scrutiny would apply if you go and try to make significant reductions or make like Washakie on wealth-based discrimination and things like that. But the court did use more of a rational basis review, looking at certain elements within the model and whether they were cost-based.
Thank you. Representative Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So on Campbell 4, the court upheld the legislature as providing an educational structure that was constitutional. What was being challenged that was overruled?
There were a number of different challenges within a number of specific components of the model that were being challenged in Campbell 4. Maintenance and operations funding was being challenged, how at-risk students were being funded, vocational education, small school adjustment, the small district adjustment, regional cost adjustment, external cost adjustment, the overall cost-based approach to funding. They also challenged the timeliness of state action. They challenged, or there was discussion related to the cost plus funding, so funding that was outside of the model, preschool funding, and then capital construction were kind of the main sub-components that were being challenged.
Thank you. That was almost everything then, right?
Yeah.
Other than that, it was a great system. Senator Hicks.
Yeah, Josh, one question here. So when I go to the Article 7, Section 9 in the Constitution, it provides the provision, and it says that that we shall provide adequate to proper instruction. So adequate education to the proper instruction of all youth in the state. And then in Campbell 1, the court opined, and on your memo, when we get to Campbell 1, it says the legislature must design the best educational system. So I'm trying to rectify the difference between the Constitution that says that we have to provide an adequate education, and then Campbell 1 says we have to do the best educational system. So can you help clarify the disparity between the Constitution and the Supreme Court ruling in that case?
Mr. Chairman, I can try, I guess. The courts spent a significant amount of time looking at the constitutional provisions, what they said, as well as what the Constitutional Convention and all that stuff, and they used a bunch of dictionaries from the time period when the Constitution was created, and they found that education was, the proper education was required, and they found that it was basically of utmost importance within our Constitution, and so they came up with this idea of that it has to be the best educational system.
Follow on, Senator Hicks.
No.
Okay, Representative Harshman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sometimes my space bar works, sometimes it doesn't. Josh, on page 9 of your presentation, and I wrote a note while you were during your presentation that about the second bullet from the bottom about the regional cost adjustment. And then you said something, and you said that should not be used to go below the statewide cost, that the model is the floor. And I just wanted to have you clarify that. What does that mean?
Sure, Mr. Chairman. So the court held that because the model was used to provide statewide costs, that while a regional cost adjustment was good for areas where there were higher costs, because it was a statewide cost to provide the education, they shouldn't use the regional cost adjustment to adjust those numbers the other way, below the amount that's generated by the model to provide funding for state instruction.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions from the Recalibration Committee? Senator Bebout.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, or Mr. Co-Chairman. Just to reiterate on the strict scrutiny, that would apply to the funding model relative to wealth primarily, but the rational would apply to like basket of goods and some of the other regional cost adjustments, some of the other things we do. Josh, would that be a fair assessment when you compare the two? Because there's a total different level, and I want to be sure that I understand the difference.
Mr. Chairman, I don't think I can say that rational basis would be, for example, if you change the basket. I mean, I think, the court has held that the current basket meets the requirements of providing a statewide education. How they would look at various changes to that, I think it would depend on the change and what it was. So I don't know that we have clear direction there on what level of scrutiny would be used.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Just quickly, just a note to staff, when we get into the basket of goods discussion, and it probably was in the material, I think maybe it was, but remind me again, our current basket, different elements of that may have been added over time. So when the court made its decision, what was in the basket and what's in the basket now? So when we get there, I think we'll go over that, but if we don't, I would like to hear that then during that.
And Mr. Chairman, I think we'll get into that quite a bit in the next presentation. It hasn't changed as far as what the legislature has done. It hasn't changed a whole lot since 97, but we'll get into that here in our next presentation.
Senator Hicks.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, just to follow up, Josh, back on the Campbell 1 and the Campbell 2 decision on where the court opined that the legislature must provide the best educational system. Not reading the whole brief, how did they go about defining what the best educational system is? Is that based on performance, or was it strictly based on financial parity? I'm just trying to understand, in the context of the court, what a best educational system is. Is that one that would provide the highest level of returns, performance-based education? So did the court opine at all on what their perception of what the best educational system and what metrics would be used to measure that? Is it just money?
I don't recall that specific. I can't remember if they got into any kind of specifics there. I have to follow up with you on that one, Mr. Chairman, and see if I can tease out what they said exactly on that. But I'm happy to do a follow-up on that, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you.
Okay, further questions from the committee before I open it up to the Joint Education Interim Committee? No, so process-wise, Matt, how are we doing this? We're just going to, how do I recognize members of the JEIC that want to ask a question?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I believe if they want to probably ask questions, they'll turn on their camera and raise their hand. And so I think the same process that your select committee is using.
All right, questions from Joint Education Committee? Anyone? All right. So do we want to open it up for comments from the public at this point? Or is that too early?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, we have 2 people for a public comment. We have Ken DeCaria from the Wyoming School Boards Association, and then Janine Bay-Teske from Teton County School District number 1.
All right.
And so we've admitted Ken DeCaria, and he should be here in just a few seconds.
All right, thank you.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I believe he's available.
Mr. DeCaria, welcome. Ken, you need to unmute yourself. There you go. Ken, you're on.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Little clunky there. Mr. Chairman, thanks. And I want to thank you. And
You gotta mute yourself. There you go.
am I good? Okay. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you and the committee for this process. I know it's
Ken, you're on.
Mr. Chairman, Ken, you need
Yeah?
to turn your YouTube off.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. Little clunky there. All right, I think I'm there right now. Did that work? I'm there? Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thanks for the opportunity. Mr. Chairman, I think this is very important what you're doing. I think it's important to go through the historical perspective. I guess for better or worse, you know, my first year in the legislature was in 1997 when we talked about the very first Campbell decision. And I guess the same applies to that I've been around it ever since. One of the things I would urge the committee to do is to make sure that you hold to the fidelity of the process and respect what the process is and what the process isn't, because I think a lot of people get a little confused as to the recalibration process and what it actually means. But it is very important as far as this. And I think the court, with their decisions have provided guidance on the issue. And the legislature over those 20 plus years has done a good job of following that advice and using that to get us to where we're at. Mr. Chairman, I think it's important that when we get to this, we remember some of the stuff in the past. For a long time, we operated under two models. We had the legislative model and what became to be called the evidence-based model over time. And the two models had different levels of funding. At the end of that process, that's when that floor became very important, is that there was a constitutional floor as far as the level of funding that needed to be provided by the legislature in order to adequately fund schools. Mr. Chairman, there are a lot of things in that Supreme Court decision, all the Supreme Court decisions, but one of the ones that I just want to real quickly point out to you, it says, to fulfill the constitutional command of equality of financing will achieve equality of quality. The legislature must state and describe what a proper education is for a Wyoming child. The Constitution requires it be the best that we can do. And so I think, that's a pretty high bar. And even looking at one of the memos that you got, I think it's important to realize that change is, it's well within your right, and I understand that, to decide what's in the basket of goods that get provided as the educational system, provided that it meets that high quality of education. And so, Mr. Chairman, I really just wanted to, thank you for what you're doing, and let you know that I think it's important that public testimony on this issue is going to be very important by stakeholders, and that the Wyoming school boards will stand ready to help in any way that we can. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Questions from the committee for Mr. DeCaria? No questions from the Joint Education Committee for Mr. DeCaria? Hearing none, thanks, Ken. Greatly appreciated.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Next up, we have Janine. There she is. And Janine, make sure your YouTube is off.
Mr.
You should be good to go. Janine, you're on. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yep, fire away.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for allowing me to testify. This happens to be my 5th recalibration. And Senator Coe and Speaker Harshman, I think you two are about the only ones that have been with us through this whole thing that continue to bring forward the institutional knowledge since we've lost Mary. I'm sorry? I just wanted to say that Josh brought it up, is
Janine, I think you need to mute your YouTube.
as Josh mentioned, this model brings forth. This is not working.
Mr. Chairman, this is Albert. Janine, you're fine. If you face your camera, your computer, your mic may be disconnecting when you move your head. I had that problem in a meeting. So we can hear you when you face straight ahead. Just face straight ahead and talk.
Okay. So See, there's a delay here that I don't know how to get out of.
Yep.
You're hearing me
Mr.
pretty
Chairman,
Yes, sir.
this is Chris and Janine. YouTube is delayed by about 10 seconds. When you're providing testimony on Zoom, you don't want to be looking at or engaging with the YouTube side of it at all. You just want to be working through the Zoom because of that delay. So close the YouTube or shut it down and just work with the Zoom. We hear you fine and we see you just fine, but we're seeing you through the Zoom in real time instead of through the YouTube.
Janine, you're on. If you just mute your YouTube, we can hear you fine.
Okay, I can't see you guys. Anyway, as Josh mentioned, the interesting thing that this model has brought forward versus the MAP model that we were using before is the transparency. You're going to go into a lot of detail tomorrow on what that transparency looks like. I just want to remind people that this really is intended to be a cost-based model. The detail of the model should be up to the local districts to be able to provide. And, you know, one of the interesting things that I've noted as I looked at some of the data is there are two factors that are really, really important as we talk about the cost of education and how it has increased over time. One of those is if you go back and you look from 2005 to present, how much our enrollment or our ADM has increased. The other is the absolutely soaring of the cost of healthcare as we move forward. And these to me are two fundamental pieces. The other thing that's happening, and it'll be interesting when we hopefully reopen schools in September or August, is what's going to happen as a result of COVID. You know, we've seen change over time in terms of the services needed for our students in our schools. We seem to be getting more students that are medically fragile. We've had to increase nursing care. We seem to be having a need for social workers and school psychologists. So it'll be interesting as we go through this process and we focus on what's happened over time and how have things changed in our schools. Because, you know, the past recalibration have really been sort of a lick and a promise. We haven't really gotten into the deep dive of it like we're going to this year. So I really look forward to working with you all and hopefully being able to answer any questions and provide any inputs that you may need. Thank you.
Any questions from the committee for Janine? Representative Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hi, Janine. Janine, I was curious about one of your early comments, which was that the model should be cost-based and it should be left up to the districts. So I'm curious if after this process, we come up with, for example, that it's $18,000 per ADM, $18,000 per kid. What would you think if we just gave to the districts that $18,000? Small, large, Teton County versus Goshen County, doesn't make a difference. You just get $18,000 per ADM.
Mr. Chair, Representative Connolly, I don't know. You know, there certainly are some small school pieces that need to be looked at. That have been adjustments in the model, and to just make a blanket statement like that without going through and looking at all the data, I really couldn't say that that's the right answer for this.
Representative Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Follow up. So Janine, so just so that you know, and as we go through the process, that caused me a bit of confusion when it was on one hand, we absolutely need to look at the kind of new and different costs when it comes to social workers, healthcare. You mentioned small schools, but on the other hand, you're saying just leave it to the districts. So to me, there's a bit of a tension between those two. And as we go forward, I think we'll need to explore that more. Would you agree?
Yes.
Okay.
All right, thank you. It's 9:25, 5 minutes before the next portion of our program. Are there any further questions for Janine from members of Recal or Education? All right, seeing none, thank you, Janine. Greatly appreciated. Glad we got the technology straightened around for you.
Thank you.
All right, before we leave this portion of the program, Josh, I just had one request. You talked about strict scrutiny as to certain portions of the model, rational as to other aspects. I think it's clear. I'd like a memo, client confidential memo that looks at the strict scrutiny piece. I see there's a bright line there as to wealth-based discrimination. But you said that when it came to a piece-by-piece examination of certain elements of the model, they adopted a rational basis. So I'd like to just get something that outlines the edges of that. When it's clear when they do strict scrutiny and when are they going to turn to rational, and with the understanding there's a lot of gray area on a lot of other aspects in between. But I'd just like to see where the bright line edges are between the two extremes. Okay, it's 9:26. Let's move on to the 9:30. Yes, Representative Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. So, Mr. Co-Chairman, I think I understand what you're asking for, but it seems like you asked for it to be a confidential memo, not a public memo. Did I understand that correctly? And I guess I'd like to understand the rationale why. Thank you.
Well,
if I understood.
Yeah, what I'm asking for is rather candid advice from the attorney, you know, in anticipation of possible litigation. The memo that we've got now is not a public memo. It's written by staff in a very candid fashion. I mean, we can let it all hang out and make it public if you'd like. Usually when your attorney gives you advice, it's confidential.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chair, co-chair.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I think at some point we may have to go into executive session on this particular issue of what is public and what is not. In my mind, the memo that was sent out June 18th, there's no reason it can't be public. This, I would rely on staff, whether they think it can be public or not public. I'm more of a let the public have the thing than not let the public have it. So we may have to have that discussion. Maybe it's just you and me as chairs with staff, and it may be the committee. But I'm certainly not afraid of the public having information. I do agree that if we have a particular bill and we get a bill together and we want to know whether that bill is in our staff's mind constitutional, then that's a behind closed door discussion. But as it relates to general information regarding what a court case may or may not have said, I'm less worried about it. So we may have to have further discussion on that as well. But certainly, yeah. So those are my comments.
Thank you. Senator Bebout.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I would agree with it, the co-chairman, what Summers said. And of course, if you're going to have a bill, you're going to need to know some of the items going into it. So why wouldn't you have that discussion? Maybe it's between the co-chairs to do that, but it makes no sense to have a bill that you may have to discuss confidentially if you're not going to discuss some of the points and items in it confidentially. So, yeah, I'm comfortable with the two of you working that out and letting the committee know what your thoughts are. And then if we need to talk about it later, yeah, let's have that discussion.
And Mr. Co-Chair, I was just reacting to what I had understood part of our discussion between ourselves and staff was. That's fine. Josh, make that memo a public memo if you could, please. I understand what Representative Summers is saying. If we've got a specific bill that we need specific advice, we'd go into executive session. Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And before we get out of this historical perspective, you know, I hate to call, you know, Hank historical at this point, but but he is, and I would really like to hear, you know, the history of what he's been through and what he's seen over time. And I don't want to take up a lot of time, but I do think that he has seen more than probably most of the rest of us. certainly Speaker Harshman as well, but Hank's been in this kind of deal from the beginning, and I would like to hear from Hank if he has any thoughts.
Senator Coe, never at a loss for words. Start at 1899 and move forward, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll go back, I guess, a little bit to what Senator Hicks, talked about the best. And, the original decision was pretty clear. And they always used a comparison between Sundance and Laramie, but the charge by the court was that we create a common basket of educational goods and services. And the real key to it was that it afford and provide equal opportunity to every child in the state, whether they live in Laramie or Cheyenne. Resources of the state will not be a factor. You will figure out a way to fund this, but I will emphasize one other thing. Clearly, constitutionally, it talks about a word called adequate, and it allows the legislature to fund K-12 in a form or a realm of being adequate. Now, we make that decision. The legislature basically makes that decision about what's adequate. So I think that's the real key to what recalibration is all about. Recalibration, we're going to look at roughly, I don't know how many components we have now, but I think it's somewhere around 37. You're exactly right. We'll go through those one by one. We had ornaments we hung on the Christmas tree over the years that became what we call the legislative model. That's compared to the evidence-based model. And I'll just use, for example, 2015, when we came up with the evidence-based model and the Joint Education Committee voted to support the legislative model to work from. So overall, the real key to this, I think, is that we have to recognize, and we did realize that, or recognize this over the years, that we got different districts that got to be funded differently. So that's why we came up with the regional cost adjustment. And just to refresh the committee, we allow districts to choose. That was a legislative prerogative that we established between WCLI, the hedonic wage index, or 100, which is statewide average. The two big components that I think that are really relevant as we go into recalibration. I might be talking too much here. I'll quiet down shortly, but clearly regional cost adjustment is huge. That's a huge component of what we look at. But market analysis, and remembering as well that in the block grant funding, over 80% of the funds that come out of the block grant to the different districts that we determine by costing out the different components, it's like 80+% is salaries and that structure. So I don't know if I answered Senator Hicks's question, but the best education that we can provide, we still get to determine that, and the key word I think is still adequate. So that's just my perspective. I hope that answers some of Representative Summers' questions. I started with MAP in 2001, although I wasn't, we didn't have a formal committee. It was done by the Appropriations Committee. Back in those days, it was Senator Kinnison. And then we moved into 2005, and the charge of our consultants in 2005 was very simple. Build us a model that we can see the moving parts, make it transparent, and that's what we've and that's what we've worked with since 2005 with Picus and Auden. So that's some of my comments, Representative Summers. Hope that helps.
Thank you, Senator Coe. Anything else from any other members of the committees? Representative Nicholas. Representative Nicholas. Representative Nicholas.
So just to follow up on your request, Mr. Chairman, I think that if you take Josh's current report, and Josh, I don't know why that wasn't, you guys didn't want to put that on the website, but I would ask that you do. I don't think there's anything in that that is providing legal opinions. And if you want to put a disclaimer in it, that would be fine. But I think it's a useful tool to start this discussion that the co-chair has asked for. But I think that one of the things that we can do is, as Senator Kinski and myself and other folks review that report and we look at the language where you differentiate the rational basis and the strict scrutiny on the fundamental rights, I think we can ask questions to you, and we can probably send you this over the next week or two, that where because they really, you got to go in a little bit more detail to understand that they kind of have a, particularly where we're on a cost basis, they have a floor established, which I think that floor is a fundamental right as it's currently drafted. And if you go in and modify that floor in terms of salaries, in terms of basic needs in the basket of goods, you will be addressing fundamental rights to some degree. And we need to know what that degree is and how to articulate that in a fashion that what we do, it makes sense to us, but also will make sense to the courts. And so we can all have a kind of a uniform understanding of where we can go with this. Otherwise, we're just going to be arguing legal semantics for four different committee meetings as we move forward into September and October. And so I think we need to work on those floor rules and make that published to everybody, so they understand. We need as much feedback on this as possible, rather than less feedback, so that basically we cover all our bases and we have a response and an answer to all of the questions that we have with regards to what those fundamental obligations are and how we can manipulate them in a way that we are still in compliance with the orders. And so I think we can work through that, but that we might want to be working through those in the next month or two so that we've got a platform that we can work from as we go forward.
So thank you, Representative Nicholas. So Josh, unless there's some objection from a member of the committee, I'd go ahead and post your memo onto the website. But I'd like to just follow up. Representative Nicholas added something to my request that's a little bit different than what I thought I was asking for. I was looking for the bright line outer edges. That is to say, here's the stuff that clearly they're going to apply rational basis. Here's the stuff that clearly bright line they're going to apply strict scrutiny. And I was asking in the middle, the ones that it's you're just not certain what they would do. Of course, whoever knows what the court would do, it's like a legislative body. What I heard Representative Nicholas saying is anything below the floor is strict scrutiny. And I don't know that I agree with that, but if that's one of those bright lines, then put that in your memo. If it's one of those that you can't say one way or the other for sure what they do, particularly in light of our fiscal emergency, then say that you can't necessarily say that as well. Thank you. Anything else? It's 9:38 before we move on. Senator Bebout.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. And to take off what Senator Coe discussed about the legislative model, and I think about the word adequate, and of course, back then when we were flush with cash, we added those ornaments, so that was what we considered to be adequate. As we move forward, we took away the legislative model, or at least cut it back, because we figured that was adequate, yet we weren't challenged. So I guess I would ask Josh to consider that or look at that. If in fact, when we did the ornaments, it was adequate, if we were to go back and say on the fundamental right that maybe adequate is different as we move forward, to see how that might play out. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Do you follow that? Did you follow Senator Bebout's request? Muted.
Senator Kinski, Senator Ellis has a question too. If that's appropriate right now.
It is. Josh, did you understand that?
I believe so, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you. Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Along those lines, I guess the question I keep hearing is, when we were getting out of the Campbell cases, the model that was picked and selected set the floor. And I don't know that that's exactly right. I mean, maybe the model selected was above what was adequate or necessary for adequate. And so maybe that's one question I've always had is, back when we were emerging out of the reins of the court, how Wyoming fared in comparison maybe to some other states. And so I'm just a little teasing out of that, because my recollection wasn't so much that Wyoming sought to invest the bare minimum, setting a floor. It really sought to invest a lot. And so that to me isn't a floor. So I just want to make sure we understand that history well.
Well, and so Senator Ellis, let me see if I understand your question as well. So what I hear you saying is some people believe that what we're funding now is the floor and we can't go below it. If I understand, you're saying no, adequate education is the floor, and we've put elements in it that move well above the constitutional adequacy level. Is that?
I want to understand the history a little bit better of what happened when we were emerging out of the Campbell cases, because right then we started having, intense energy booms that provided a lot of revenue. And so rather than trying to tease out what the floor would be, I think Wyoming picked a model. And to say that it was a floor, I don't know is accurate. I think Wyoming at that time could afford and wanted to spend quite a bit, invest a lot in education. And so I just want to make sure I understand that history.
Thank you. Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I think Senator Ellis brings up a good point and a good piece of history that needs to be brought out. And I certainly don't know it all. I wasn't there, but Senator Coe was. I think what you'll find, and it's a good exercise, I really do. But I think what you'll find is that we were flush and we went away from the consultants model and created the legislative model that Senator Coe talked about. And we added things in there that were whatever we wanted, the mix that Wyoming wanted. And eventually we created what was called the legislative model, or termed that. And certainly it was different than the consultants model. I think what I want to understand from Josh and what the court said was what the consultant came up with in their model. Was that a floor for the cost of education? Certainly as we came out, as the legislature came out, we provided a different model. And so I do agree with Senator Ellis. I think understanding a little bit more about that history of how those two models diverged and what the court was talking about when they were talking about a model, I think that is important to know, Josh. So thank you.
Anyone else? All right, it's 9:42. Let's move on to the 9:30 a.m. portion of the program, Wyoming Education.
Hello? Mr. Co-Chair.
Oh, Representative Harshman.
Just had a real quick comment, if I could, Mr. Co-Chair, just on that, and Senator Coe, appreciate all his service, has been in the middle of that. And I joined in 2003 into this discussion, but really, I think it was all about these choices, going back to Senator Ellis. And I think as we were given a cost-based, evidence-based model, then we had some choices. And we did make some choices from, how we fund charter schools with really double payments, how we fund CTE, with the multiplier 2.9%, small school adjustments. All those things have become part of Wyoming because I think as one of us said earlier, we have so many different situations out there, and we've just tried to recognize that and deal with those. But yeah, and I think we're going to learn all that as we go through this process, I guess, as a committee. You're going to learn about all these model components and how they started and what's the evidence behind them. So thank you.
Anything else before we move on? All right, let's go ahead and move on to the, Senator Cost.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. I just had one question with regards to what Representative Harshman had said. He said 2.9 on those CTE, and I thought it was 1.29. I just wanted to make sure that I didn't have the wrong percentage on that for the adjustment. The other thing that I think is important for us to remember is, and I know we're going to get into it later, adequate doesn't mean the top of the line. Adequate doesn't mean the bottom of the barrel either, but I think we can come up with a pretty good definition of what adequate does cover. And it has a potential to maybe change our perspective on some things.
Thank you. Was that a question for Representative Harshman or for staff about the multiplier?
It could have been for either. I just needed to find out if I was incorrect on the 1.29 rather than the 2.9.
Matthew, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, this is a little technical, but we provide an additional 29% weight to provide additional staff to make the career technical education courses smaller. So Speaker Harshman is correct that the 29% weight was a addition by the Wyoming legislature beyond the recommendations from its 2015 recalibration.
Thank you. Representative Freeman, you raised your hand.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I don't have a legislative experience, but I do have a teacher experience. I was a teacher in Sweetwater County in 2005, and I was busily looking for another job because my teacher salary wasn't able to adequately support myself, my wife, and 3 children. A lot of people through my experience in the legislature talks about the 2006 bump. That is when teachers, there was enough money going into the foundation program to where the teachers or school districts could pay teachers adequately. And so when you look at the history, you should probably look at what the status of Wyoming's education was in 2005 and why it needed to be changed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anything else before we move on? Anyone else? All right, let's go ahead and move on to the 9:30 a.m. portion of the program, Wyoming Education Program. That would be Appendix 3-01. And again, we'll turn it over to Matt Wilmarth and Josh Anderson of the Legislative Service Office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll start this presentation. Josh will take a slide on kind of the Campbell 1 requirements again, and then I'll proceed on the presentation. So let me share my screen. And you should see the first slide. Within this presentation, we'll again kind of review the court mandates specifically towards the educational program, and then the legislative response. We'll review the educational program itself, and then compare, as a request from the chairman, a comparison of the benchmark states for the 2017 APA study. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll let Josh again talk about slide 3 on really what the Campbell 1 decision required of the educational program.
So, Mr. Chairman, slide 3, again, it's same slide that you saw in the previous presentation. Again, the legislature is required to define and specify what proper education is for a Wyoming child, noting again that at the time, the court noted that there was a potential for 49 different autonomous education systems, required the legislature to establish and maintain a complete and uniform system of public instruction, and required education to equip students for their future roles as citizens, participants in the political system, and competitors both economically and intellectually.
So, Mr. Chairman, one important point about the system in place for the educational program prior to 1997 is that each school district, through the board rules and regulations, were to set its own level of standards and required students to meet those standards as determined by each of the districts. And that conflicted with the court's requirement and the Constitution's requirement that it be a uniform system. And so the court found that piece of allowing districts to set their own standards to be unconstitutional, as it delegated that duty of the legislature to local school districts. So in the 1997 special session, the legislature established a statutory framework that defined the educational program. And much of that remains the same today. It's very similar. The legislature defined a specific set of common core of skills and knowledge that all public school students should have the opportunity to receive across the state. And I'll get into that a little bit later. Also within statute, districts are required to provide students the opportunity to acquire sufficient knowledge and skills at a minimum to enter the University of Wyoming. It appears that my screen is not being shared correctly. Karen, if you can go to slide 4.
Mr. Chairman, Matt, your screen's not there. Now your screen is being shared.
Okay, my apologies about that. If I need to go back, just let me know. Again, my apologies. So in statute, the legislature set forth that the knowledge and skills that students should have the opportunity to acquire shall at minimum allow them to enter the University of Wyoming and community colleges. It should prepare students for the job market or post-secondary vocational and technical training. And then also general purposes of education that equip students, as Josh is both indicated, to equip them for their roles as citizens and a participant of the political system and compete both intellectually and economically. The second legislative response was to charge the State Board of Education to establish uniform performance standards and graduation requirements. And again, the board initially was required to review the quality of these standards every 5 years and report their findings and recommendations to the Joint Education Committee. In turn, the Joint Education Committee would then report its findings to the legislature annually. It also, as part of this framework, required the State Board of Education to evaluate and accredit school districts on the educational program offered and ensure that those educational programs offered were in accordance with the performance standards set forth by the State Board of Education. And then another part of that response was the establishment of a statewide summative assessment and district assessment systems that measured how students performed against those standards. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, the educational program is primarily set up in Wyoming Statute 21.9.101 and 21.9.102, and there's a few other provisions that I'll discuss. But the first item is 21.9.101, and it's in subsection B, paragraphs 1 and 3, and they define a specific set of common core of knowledge and skills that students should be provided the opportunity to acquire. And then also within subsection C, the uniform performance standards and the educational program offered should also ensure that students with disabilities and students with that are gifted and talented are also provided an opportunity to learn the common core of knowledge and skills. Additionally, subsections D and F relate to class sizes, and specifically that Initially in 1997, there was a request that districts maintain a desired ratio of 20 students per teacher in grades K through 3. This was lowered in 2012 by the legislature. There was a requirement in statute that required districts to provide class sizes on average of 16 students per teacher in order to participate in the school foundation program. That mandate was repealed in 2017, but the requirement within the educational program statutes to endeavor to maintain a class size ratio of 16 students per teacher remained. Also in the statute, in subsection E, it encourages school districts to establish co-curricular activity programs as part of the educational experiences within school districts. And then finally, in addition, beyond the 1997 response was the requirement that districts provide foreign language instruction in grades K through 2. This was a bill enacted in 1999 and went into effect beginning the 2002-2003 school year. So that's the main charge within 21-9-101. Additionally, 21-9-102 requires all schools and colleges in the state supported by public funds to instruct students in the essentials of the Wyoming and the U.S. constitutions. The requirements is that the requirements require that at least 3 years are provided under these in grades K through 8. So, and then there's also a 1 year requirement to teach these essentials in secondary and college grades. And then there's a further requirement that a student may not receive a high school diploma or college degree without passing an examination on the Wyoming and U.S. constitutions. In addition to the requirements in 21-9, 101, and 102, there are provisions outside that influence the educational program. The first one, as a result of a 2006 law, the Department of Education was charged in consultation with the Wyoming Department of Transportation to establish standards through rule for driver education programs. And these would be for programs in high schools, private schools, community colleges, BOCES, which are Board of Cooperative Educational Services, community education programs, and then also driver education schools. These aren't a mandate to provide these programs, but rather if a high school were to provide these education programs, that they would follow the rules set forth by the Department of Education. Additionally, in 2017, the legislature enacted a law that required that part of the social studies student content performance standards address the cultural and heritage, history, and contemporary contribution of American Indians. And that's contained within 21-4-602. And then in 2018, school districts were authorized with permission from a student's parent or legal guardian to educate students on child sexual abuse prevention as part of the health and safety component of the Common Core of Knowledge. And then finally, not necessarily directly related as part of the educational program, but the Hathaway Scholarship Program success curriculum shall be aligned to the uniform content and performance standards that's adopted by the State Board of Education. There have been minimal statutory changes since 1997 to the educational program. In the totality of the educational program and how it's been measured, there have been some significant modifications. The first one, and really this came out of a result of the 2010 recalibration, where the legislature was satisfied with the cost of education, but not necessarily the performance of education. And This resulted in legislation in the 2011 and subsequent sessions of an accountability system deemed the Wyoming Accountability in Education Act. And so the accountability systems have been established to meet both state and federal mandates. So that's been a very significant change since 1997. Additionally, one of the changes is the requirement of the State Board of Education to review its standards every 9 years. Originally, it was set at every 5 years. And so that has been increased every 9 years. And then there's also been modifications to the statewide summative assessment. Right now, we're on a version called YTOP. And so that's been a significant change as well. And then also there's been a large modification to the district assessment system. And I'll get into this a little bit in the graduation discussion, but in 2002, the legislature established what they called the body of evidence system. And this was a system used by districts to determine how students met each of the standards through assessing each of the content areas. And through the graduation standards, there was a 3-tiered system where a student could receive an advanced diploma, a comprehensive diploma, or a general diploma. This body of evidence system and that 3-tiered graduation diploma system was repealed in 2015. And then finally, the last bullet, while there haven't been many changes to the statutory charges of the educational program, the State Board of Education has routinely updated its standards for each of its content areas. And so while the legislature may not make changes to specific, mathematics, the underlying standards within mathematics have been updated frequently by the State Board of Education. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, the Common Core of knowledge and skills, as I indicated, are set forth in subsection B in paragraphs 1 and 3 of the Common Core of knowledge and the Common Core of skills. You can see there have been minimal changes, and these changes occurred as a result of a 2018 legislative session, chapter 123. Those changes repealed subparagraph M, applied technology, and added computer science. And then for the Common Core skills, keyboarding was repealed or deleted and inserted computational thinking. Another important aspect of the Common Core of knowledge and skills is that within subsection B, paragraph 2 requires that the knowledge areas of reading, language arts, and mathematics are emphasized in grades 1 through 8. And that's been the requirement since the 1997 special session. Finally, with regards to graduation requirements, again, the charge to the State Board of Education as they set up their standards for the Common Core of knowledge and skills is that within the standards, they are to select a certain set of, a subset of those standards that are deemed graduation requirements. In addition to those graduation requirements within the standards, Wyoming law requires that students complete at least 4 years of English to receive a diploma, and then 3 years of mathematics, science, and social studies. In addition to the constitutional or U.S. and Wyoming Constitution examinations. I've had a few questions regarding the graduation requirements and the requirements of the standards and which standards need to be completed. I think some legislators have been around here and heard the discussions on informal attorney general's opinions There was an opinion in 2017 that has since been replaced with advice in 2019. The 2017 informal opinion advised the State Board of Education that the board did not have to prescribe performance levels to be met for each of the standards. The 2019 informal opinion reversed that advice and indicated that the State Board of Education needs to determine the performance level that students need to meet for graduation requirements. And so during the Joint Education Committee's June 4th and 5th meeting, the committee heard from both the Department of Education and the State Board of Education and the Attorney General's office. They are working on updating their rules to identify certain criteria within the standards that are deemed to be graduation requirements. As I indicated, the body of evidence system in 2015 that was repealed, I think that set in motion some disruption in how districts perceived what the requirements of graduation were. And so the State Board is currently undertaking this work and will address this in their rules. Mr. Chairman, this might be a good spot to pause for any questions before I go into the comparison of Wyoming's educational program to other states.
Thank you, Matt. Questions from Recalibration. Representative Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. So, Mr. Wilmarth, on slide 7, you made the notation about statute 219101B, Romanet 2, regarding the emphasis for reading, language arts, and mathematics. And I guess I would like to understand, is there any evidence that is actually occurring? Is there evidence that the resources are being directed differently because of that particular statutory requirement for grades 1 through 8? Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Co-Chairman.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Barlow, that's a good question. I would say there are probably more rigorous standards for career technical education, foreign language, and a few other maybe content areas that are more rigorous at the secondary level. But I don't know exactly how districts emphasize those two content areas over the other requirements of, let's just say, physical education. I think it probably depends on how schools set up their schedules and how many days they spend on mathematics and language arts and reading throughout the week versus maybe science twice a week. But that's something that we can certainly follow up on with the Department of Education and State Board of Education.
Thank you. Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I kind of have a series of questions. So Matt, I'm still not clear. Were all of those items in the basket of goods, Common Core of Knowledge, were they all in place in 1997 except computer science? So I kind of want to, if we don't have it, I want a breakdown of what went in where, and then did the Common Core skills come in 1997? Did it come in at a later period of time? So that's my first question, Mr. Chairman.
Matt?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Representative Summers, I'll go back to that slide. So both the Common Core of Knowledge and Skills that you see listed, those were all in place as a result of the 1997 special session. The strike and underscore that you see are the only changes since 1997, and that was a result of the 2018 session laws, chapter 123, and it repealed the applied technology paragraph and added computer science in the knowledge area. And then in the skills area, it removed keyboarding and added computational thinking. So 1997 to 2018, it was constant. And those were the only changes since that time.
And then a follow-up, Mr. Chairman, on that item. And so and this maybe is to Josh. So when the court looked at the basket of goods, they were looking at the basket of goods that was put in place by the legislature in 1997. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, Mr. Chairman.
And then, Mr. Chairman, just a couple of other things. And one that gets me kind of going is the Hathaway. It's a great program, but make no mistake, it has driven education in the state of Wyoming like maybe no other state. There's nothing that will drive people more than money. And so my question to you, Matt, and I honestly can't remember, but I believe the highest level of the Hathaway has requirements in it that are higher than the graduation requirements. Is that true? Is there, kind of remind me of that.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Summers, I think this is a tricky question in that I don't think there's a clear understanding of what the State Board of Education's graduation standards are. But the statutory requirements of 3 years of math is different than what the honors scholarship program, Hathaway Scholarship is, and that requires 4 years of math. Other than that, it's pretty much, and I think I touched on that a little bit in the later slide, but that's primarily the key difference. There are some requirements that you have to complete 2 years of foreign language, and obviously that's not a statutory requirement of the law. Does that help?
Mr. Chairman, that answers my question. And to the committee, my point on this is that school districts are driven to provide the criteria for the maximum amount of the Hathaway. So make no mistake that even though if we as a state have in statute, whatever we have, whatever the Hathaway is, will help drive that cost of education. And then the one other thing that you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, the one other thing that Matt mentioned on the 16-to-1, and I heard the word endeavor, and so endeavor to provide. So what exactly does the statute say about 16-to-1?
Yeah, so Mr. Chairman, that's within subsection D, 21.9.101 subsection D, and I'll read it for you. In addition to subsections B and C of this section, each school district within the state shall endeavor to maintain, when practicable, in kindergarten through grade 3 within the district, an average class size of no more than 16 students per teacher, excluding children with disabilities who spend more than 50% of their time outside of regular classroom instruction.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any other questions from Recalibration Committee at this point? Representative Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I got a little confused, Matt, when we were talking about the standards of the State Board of Education. I mean, partly I don't understand the exact relationship that would have to our constitutional requirements in terms of providing the education. But then you basically said there were conflicting AG opinions. And I don't, in general, my attitude about opinions is that's what they are. So I'm wondering how much that second AG opinion is driving the standards from the State Board.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Representative Schwartz, the State Board is required to set standards, performance standards, for each of the Common Core of knowledge and skills areas. So, and they need to be uniform across the state to ensure that each student has the opportunity to obtain the same level of knowledge, skills, and education across the state. So that's the charge of the State Board. Prior to 1997, each district set their own standards. And so there wasn't a uniformity across the state, and it provided different opportunities for students depending on where they lived. And so the Constitution requirement to provide a uniform education system it is driving that charge to the state board. So the legislature is delegated to the state board. You need to set these standards that all students can achieve across the state. And they do that for each of those areas. With regards to your second question on the conflicting AG advice, the 2017 informal opinion indicated that the state board doesn't need to set those standards or those performance standards for students to meet graduation requirements, which goes against the charge of what the statute requires of the state board. And so in 2018, there was clarification advice given to the state boards. No, you need to set performance standards for each of those areas, and then within those, define a subset of those standards that you deem as appropriate to meet graduation requirements. So I hope that clarifies your questions. If not, I'll try to do better.
For the moment, it does. I may come back to it.
Thank you. Other questions from Recalibration Committee? Senator Cost.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. There's a couple of things that I still have concern on. First of all, I need to make sure that I'm correct on the fact that there is not a requirement that we test every grade from grade 3 through grade 10 or grade 11 federally or whatever. I'm thinking that that's a state requirement. The other is with the Attorney General's decision in 2019, the performance descriptors that were listed all of a sudden became all the testing area for all the students. So there's a concern of mine on the amount of testing that's required of our students. I think there's a way to make that a little simpler, but that can be discussed later. We've got to be careful on the amount of testing. We've got to be careful on the amount of requirements we're putting on these students as well as on the teachers. And I think we got to take a look at some things. If you look at the Common Core of Skills and you ask yourself, how is a teacher going to evaluate in any way that they can show data on problem solving, interpersonal communications, critical thinking, and creativity? Those are pretty difficult to identify. Yeah, there's ways of doing it, but I think it creates a situation that might be a little more difficult if there's a requirement for that to be shown. With that in mind, problem solving and critical thinking and those things become the applications within the Common Core of Knowledge. And I think that that helps us to maybe better understand that they're used in those and understood. And so do we have to identify them as a must as far as skills, or can we say those need to be incorporated and make it a little easier for the teachers and the students? The other thing is reading and mathematics are real critical for K1, 2, and 3. They're real critical all the way up, but I do know that there is strong focus on our younger grades. And then as we move up, it becomes more worked into the social studies and science as well. So that emphasis, I think, is understandable, and I'm appreciative of the fact that in the younger grades, they're not saying, okay, we better make sure that we've got to have a ton of science, a ton of social studies. Let's just make sure that we're covering them. The other thing that I think becomes a question for Matt, I would like to know how many of our school districts apply or ask for a waiver on the class size of their K through 3 students, which is currently set at 16-1, because I'm under the understanding there's a large number of the larger schools that ask for a waiver on that. And that would be the only question I have. The rest was just thoughts for people to think about. Thank you.
So, Mr. Chairman and Senator Cost, the response on the 16-to-1, as I indicated in 2012, there was a change to the law that required school districts, in order for them to participate in the school foundation program funding, they had to maintain a class size of 16-to-1. And there were certain exceptions if they exceeded that ratio. In the 2017 session, that requirement and the requirement to receive a waiver, or even the requirement to maintain a class size of 16-to-1 in grades K through 3 was repealed. And so that is no longer a requirement. There's no process for a waiver. The only requirement now is within the 21.9.101D is that district shall endeavor to maintain a ratio of 16-to-1. Again, that was set at 20 in 1997. It was modified or amended in the 2012 session. It was not further amended back to 20 in 2017 when the other provision was repealed. But there is no requirement for a waiver process under 21.9.101D. That was only specifically to a statute that has been repealed.
Senator Cost, follow up.
Yeah, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but in the block grant, we're still paying for 16-to-1. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, correct, Senator Cost. We resource elementary grades at 16 teachers one teacher for every 16 students.
Okay, other questions from education before Senator Bebout.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Just several questions, and maybe something that Matt could help us out with in some, doing some research. And of course, the special session in 97 was because of the decision in 95, the Washakie 1 decision. And part of that, what we did in the special session was the measure student performance on a statewide basis. And over the years, that's changed. We've gone to different ways, national, back to state, different things. I think we're in YCAS now, whatever. Maybe Matt could provide us a little history there. That might provide us some insight as to how we look at this and might be beneficial to us. The second thing, Mr. Co-Chair, and in 99, we did the 21.9.101, and it really hasn't changed a lot, as you mentioned, Matt, over the years. And the question I have there is it hasn't changed a lot in terms of the statutes, but changes have occurred in terms of how we do it. And Senator Coe talked about now 37 ways we do the cost basis method. Maybe that's what changed a lot of it. So I'm wondering, I'm asking Matt, what were the changes that occurred since we didn't change the statutes, but over time to get us to where we are today? And maybe that's some research. Of course, one of them is classroom size, obviously. And when we talk about classroom size, clearly the legislature, this is a question, Matt, clearly the legislature can decide on classroom size in the model. And that would be my comments. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Chairman and Senator Bebout, your kind of first question on statewide assessments. The first iteration of the statewide assessment was called the YCAS system. Then it evolved in the mid-2000s to the PAWS. And now we're under the YTOP. And again, that's the statewide summative assessment system. That is not very comparable to other states. We do, as part of the YTOP testing regimen, we do participate in a consortium with other states. So I believe some of those YTOP assessments can be comparable to other states. I'd have to defer to the Department of Education. Maybe tomorrow when they do their presentation on the NAEP, the federal assessment, they can comment on that. We also require in the 11th grade, and we've instituted this since the institution of the Hathaway program, is 11th graders are required to partake in the ACT So they're required to take that as well. One other, I think, significant change in the YTOP, or the most recent summative assessment system, is the legislature mandated that no more than 1% of a school year's time can be spent on the statewide assessment. And that was a pretty significant change back in, I think, 2014 or 2015. And so prior to then, there was no limitation on how long those took. And so it is maximum time of 1%. Regarding your other question on the Common Core knowledge and skills and how frequently those get updated, again, the statutory updates have been once in 2018, but the State Board of Education has frequently updated its standards. And I think the most significant changes have occurred in mathematics, reading and language arts, and science. And then I would also say with the addition of the American Indian Education for All as part of the social studies content performance standards most recently, those are probably the 4 areas where the most significant changes have occurred. With the mathematics and English language arts, the state, along with many other states, adopted primarily what is deemed as the Common Core state standards in those 2 areas. And then for science, Wyoming adopted primarily, but not all, of what is deemed as national standards, the next generation science standards. So those have been recent changes. I believe the mathematics and language arts occurred in 2012, and then science occurred within the past 5 years.
Further questions? Senator Bebout, follow up.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just on the classroom size, clearly that's within the legislative purview under the adequate. We could do that, and you're nodding your head. And I understand this. So I wanted to clarify that. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I missed that. Yeah, you are correct. The class size, and I think you'll hear from your consultants on what their recommendations are. Certainly that's the prerogative of the legislature.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, just quickly, I think Representative Peeperinen is trying to get into, he's in the waiting room trying to get in, and maybe he's got a phone number and not his name attached. So I just wanted to let staff know that he sent me a text. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Further questions from Recalibration Committee before I open it up to Joint Education? Representative Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. So my query is, while we don't mandate the 16-to-1 ratio, we clearly know what is actually being implemented by school district. Would that be a correct statement over time? We do know what's actually being implemented, so we do have that historical perspective. Is that correct? Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Barlow, correct. So tomorrow, I believe you'll get a presentation from the Department of Education and how districts actually allocate the funding or the resources within the block grant. And teachers is there's quite a difference in between the number of teachers actually hired versus those paid or those resourced.
Anything else from Recalibration Committee? Okay, questions from Joint Education Committee on what we've heard in the first 8 slides of the 26-slide presentation. Okay, I'm not seeing anything. Do we want to take comment here at this point on this much of it, or do we want to let Matt get through the rest of his presentation? Albert, what do you think?
Mr. Chairman, I think just let Matt continue, and if there's no questions if the Joint Education Committee has any, yes. If not, I think we just go on, and then after the whole presentation, we take public comment.
Okay.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think this next part will go fairly quick.
Okay, before you start in on it, Matt, I just want to make sure Joint Education, none of those folks have any questions. All right, if not, it's now 10:30. which is scheduled time for our first 10-minute break. Let's take a 10-minute break and we will be back here at 10:40. Matt, I have 1040. Is that what you have?
Mr. Chairman, I have 1037 on my computer.
All right, we'll just give it a couple more minutes. Is it time?
Just under a minute here.
Okay. I've got 3 clocks and 3 different times.
Take an average.
That's why I'm relying on you. The phone, computer, and the iWatch.
I now have 1040.
Yeah, let's go ahead and come back. It's 1040. I think folks will be, I'll be here in just a moment. We are part of the way through our 9:30 presentation. It's 1040 now, and we're supposed to be setting off with Picus and Auden, but it's been a good discussion, and we knew the agenda was ambitious. So let's go ahead and pick up with Mr. Wilmarth on the balance of his presentation on the Wyoming Education Program. Slide 9, I think, Matt. There you go.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, you should be on slide 9, and the title should read, "How does Wyoming compare?" And so, as I indicated in the opening comments, the chairman requested that I summarize what was reviewed during the 2017 recalibration study by Augenblick, Palak and Associates, APA. And what they were charged to do during that recalibration effort was to examine the Wyoming Education Program and compare it to 13 states. And the 7 regional states that are contiguous to Wyoming, but also what they deemed as high-performing states. And so they determined Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, Indiana, Virginia, and Vermont as high-performing states. And how they determined that were a couple different factors. They looked at the K-12 performance ratings on the 2015 National Assessment of Educational Progress. That's the NAEP. That's the federal assessment that's administered across all states in grades 3 and 8. I believe 4 and 8, sorry. And then also they adjusted those NAEP results for the demographics of each of the states. And then also they reviewed the K-12 achievement factor and rating by EdWeek, a national publication with a grade C or better. And then they also looked at EdWeek's ranking of their state academic standards. Another factor that they utilized in determining high-performing states was post-secondary and workforce readiness indicators. And so they used federal Perkins career technical education data. They also adjusted that data for the career technical education composite score. And then they used the Education Commission of States College and Readiness scoring rubric as well. So that's kind of the background on how they determined those high-performing states. Within their study, they looked at 4 areas. One were kind of the overall content areas and what standards are established in each of these 13 states. They did a very in-depth review, and I'll kind of go through these with you today on English language arts, mathematics, and science. I will tell you, I don't have specific understanding of each of these standards. I am summarizing the summary from APA, so I probably won't be able to address specific questions related to certain states, including Wyoming. And then they also reviewed other states' scholarship programs and how those relate to the graduation standards, similar to what we discussed with the Hathaway Scholarship Program. And then they also looked at special populations such as gifted and talented students and students with disabilities. So with that, Mr. Chairman, on slide 10, the cross-state comparison of content areas, the study found that Wyoming has similar standards compared to the 13 comparative states. All of the states had standards in English, language arts, mathematics, science, social studies, fine and performing arts, foreign language, and health and physical education. There were some variances in the career and technical education standards. Wyoming was most similar to New Hampshire and New Jersey, where those standards applied to all of the K-12 students. Sorry about that. Also, the 2017 study found that 10 states had separate technology or computer science standards. And again, this was in 2017. And then the following session, the legislature modified the Common Core of Knowledge areas and added computer science and removed applied technology. And then other content areas that had differences, 4 states had library standards, 3 states had financial literacy standards, and then 2 states had driver education standards. Specifically to English language arts, there were 4 states that were different from Wyoming. For the regional states, this included Colorado and Nebraska. And then for the high-performing states, these included Massachusetts and Virginia. Specifically, Wyoming standards were identical or similar to those remaining 9 states. For Colorado, they had more standards than Wyoming, but they also excluded some that were contained in Wyoming standards. Nebraska was fairly different in that they did not base their standards on the Common Core state standards that many of the states across the nation have adopted. And they varied in specificity from Wyoming, but they also included many more standards than Wyoming. For Massachusetts, they had standards for pre-K students and other standards for earlier grades. And then they also established English language art standards across mathematics, history, social studies, science, career technical education, speaking and listening standards. And then Virginia did not varied by not including what they termed as strategy usage, handwriting research, and ethical and safe usage of internet and technology. The next area that they did the deep dive on was mathematics. For the regional states, again, Nebraska was different than Wyoming. And then for the high performing states, Indiana and Virginia differed. Wyoming was similar to the remaining 10 states. Specifically on the differences, Indiana, their standards vary substantially. They were more condensed and expansive than those of Wyoming. Nebraska, again, were not based upon the Common Core state standards and were less comprehensive than Wyoming. And then Virginia contained fewer, less comprehensive standards than Wyoming. For science, there were 3 states that were different than Wyoming. For the regional states, that Utah was different. And then for the high-performing states, Indiana and Virginia were different. Specifically for Indiana, their high school science standards were more organized by each of the courses offered within the high schools. And then for middle school, the standards are more organized by grade level. For Utah, their standards covered the same content areas as Wyoming, but they were just structured with fewer objectives and at different grade levels. And overall, they were less rigorous in some of the areas. And then finally, for science, Virginia, Wyoming standards were more focused on the scientific method and more aligned to the national standards, as I previously indicated. And then also Wyoming standards were more specific and rigorous, involved more investigation and problem solving. APA also performed an analysis that compared graduation standards and then the scholarship programs offered in those states. As you know, the Halfway Scholarship Program success curriculum is very similar to graduation standards for Wyoming, except in the honors and performance scholarships, there's a little bit more rigorous standards. There are some difficulties in comparing these graduation standards across states due to the way states require courses or credits to be accumulated. And then 2 states, Colorado and Massachusetts, focused more on a competency-based outcome rather than specific course requirements. And I will just let you know again, this is one area that the Joint Education Committee is studying this interim as part of the educational program. The state superintendent is interested in this discussion with the committee. And so there'll probably be more discussion later this interim with the Joint Education Committee on that topic. With regards to this specific analysis, all states' graduation standards are required English and mathematics. Most states required 4 years of English and 3 years of math, which is similar to Wyoming. And then states with tiered diplomas require 4 years of math for their advanced diploma. All states with course requirements on average require 3 years of science and social studies, again, similar with Wyoming. And then foreign language requirements was one area where there was differences. New Jersey required at least a year for all students to graduate. And then Indiana and Virginia required at least 3 years to receive their advanced diploma. Again, as I previously mentioned, the career technical education requirements varied across states. Most states required this or didn't require it. It was an elective option. New Jersey and Montana required a year of it for all students. And then Indiana encouraged elective choices to be college or career options required for their diploma with technical honors. And then also Virginia included a completion of a pathway program as part of their standard diploma. And then Other requirements varied across all the states, including fine arts, humanities, physical education, health, personal finance, and economics. The Hathaway Scholarship Program, specifically the honors and performance, those levels, when they were implemented, were aligned to the University of Wyoming's admission requirements, and they still are pretty well aligned to those. When they compared scholarship programs across other states, they were comparable to other universities in the benchmark states and had very similar course requirements. And similar with the honors and performance, a fourth year of math was required. And then the final analysis that they completed in 2017 was related to the special populations. Again, Wyoming in its Common Core of knowledge and skills, I think it's in subsection C of 21.9.101, requires students with disabilities and gifted talent students to be provided those educational opportunities. And so, first of all, the students with disabilities is a federal requirement under IDEA, and each of those students are provided a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. And that's a practice that Wyoming follows, obviously. Generally, there were minimal variations among states for special education requirements. And then they studied the variation among states for alternative achievement standards. So similar to Wyoming, we have different standards or assessments for students with severe cognitive disabilities, and that's afforded to many of the states as well. Next slide, slide 25. Colorado, Indiana, Massachusetts, and Virginia, similar to Wyoming, have alternate standards in social studies and history, even though they may not be assessed in those areas. And then, except for two states, the age range for public education was 3 for 21, or ages 3 to 21, which is similar to Wyoming. Nebraska started at birth, and then Virginia started at age 2. And then the most transition services, again, are from age range 16 to 21. Gifted and talented, there were varying definitions of what gifted and talented students are. And then less than half of the states that they reviewed had mandates about how to serve students with gifted and talented abilities. And then the most frequent instruction method to deal with those students was just to differentiate the instruction across grades. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I provided a few links within this presentation that members can read at their leisure. The details of this study from APA is provided in the 2017 recalibration report. And then there were 3 memos presented at the June 4th and 5th Education Committee meeting that members can read. One is a more detailed memo on the educational program and the kind of legislature's initial response in 1997 that Josh and I wrote. And then the Department of Education and State Board of Education also have information that they shared. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Matt, questions from Recalibration Committee for Mr. Wilmarth. Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank you, Matt. And that was, at my request primarily, but I'm sure my co-chair would agree with me. I think we need to understand, and I want to just give a little dialogue why I think it's important we see this. As we all know that we or the consultants, and then we cost out education based upon on the basket of goods. And I think it's important to understand where we're at and what other states are doing, and then how we want to go forward, because if we go forward in a different manner, that can change, obviously, the cost of education. So whether we reduce or add to that basket of goods, it changed the cost. And so, just Mr. Chairman,
I've got a follow on to that, and it's a request of staff, and it's a follow up with your question, historical question to Senator Coe. Back in '97, when they did MAP and then the evidence-based model, the consultants just didn't, they had to be given direction. Here's what we want, cost this out. And I'd like to know what was given to the consultants in our current model. So far, I've heard 21.9101, 29.102. Then there are high school graduation requirements, which evidently are additive or are more than just what's in 29.9101. Hathaway, driving, uniform content and performance standards, of which there's thousands now. GATE. What was handed to consultants and saying, study this and tell us how much it's going to cost to deliver this adequately? Do you know off the top of your head, or do you need to go back and dig through the historical record, Matt, or were they just given 29 or 21.9101, the basket of goods?
Mr. Chairman, I can't speak to the 1997 initial response from legislature. As I indicated in my earlier presentation, the State Board of Education had a set of rules, and which were pretty similar to what was adopted in law. It wasn't exactly what was adopted in law, but the State Board of Education had common core of knowledge of skills and in their rules that districts set their own standards to. That was then put out to what they called a blue ribbon panel, and it was about a 2-year process that vetted what stakeholders across Wyoming deemed important, and that eventually put in the knowledge and skills areas. I don't know the interaction between legislative consultants between the Campbell 1 decision in '95 and the '97 decision. I don't know what interaction they had on what they determined was educational program, and then what they used, what they determined how to cost that out. I don't have the history on that. From the 2005 and forward, our consultants have reviewed our statutory requirements as kind of the basis of where they come up with their recommendations. And I think Drs. Pikus and Auden can get in this and what they use to determine what they believe is an adequate level of education. And I probably defer to them on how they look at our statutes in contrast to what they determine is an adequate level of resources for the educational program.
Matthew, I may not be asking the question, and maybe Senator Coe or co-chair can help me out. We define what's adequate. We hand to the consultants, here's what our education is, here's what we define as adequate, cost this out for us. So what I'm asking for is, and you can get it from the consultants or whomever, 05, what did we hand them? And what are we going to hand them this time around? Did we just hand them 21.9101 and the Hathaway Success Curriculum and the content and performance standards? It's important, because the more you layer on there, the more expensive it's going to get. Senator Coe, do you know what was given to the consultants for the model that we're using now?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My recollection, they had the basket to look at and to cost out. And I think we got to remember as well that we don't have a mandated state curriculum. Local districts still create their own curriculum. Let's remember that. And that's the best I can answer it. We handed the consultants in 2005 the basket of educational goods and services and asked them to cost it all out, all 37 components or whatever there is in there, based on the basket that was there at the time. And so I got to tell you, we're handing the consultants This time in 2020, we're handing them the current basket of educational goods and services that we have adopted through the state board, or the state board has adopted. And statutorily, that's their direction to adopt Common Core skills and standards. So we're handing the consultants that basket right now to cost out. Now, if somebody wants to correct me, maybe Speaker Harshman or somebody else, or Representative Summers who's been involved, or Senator Rothfuss, but that's the way I would respond to that.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I think that's a good explanation. Just to finish up what my thoughts were, goes right to this very issue. If we want to change the basket of goods in this process, and therefore, if that's what somebody wants to do to affect the cost of education, then we need to have that discussion sooner rather than later during this process. So if members of Recalibration, in my mind, we took a hard look at that in 2017. We ended up adding in computer science, somewhat based upon that and based upon other things. If we want to detract from that, if we want to take away from that as a committee, I think we need to have that discussion next committee meeting. Are we gonna change the basket of goods? I think we should have that sooner rather than later, and so the consultants understand what their expectation is in looking at what they're costing out. And I think APA will, or not APA, but Picus and Odin will talk about what they're utilizing. But I guess that was my point, and my comment to this committee is if we want to change the basket of goods, we need to think about that sooner rather than later, and have that discussion and debate.
And Mr. Co-Chair, your point is well taken, and I'm not advocating changing the basket of goods. My question is exactly what was given to the consultants. Staff had to put together an RFP based on a direction for in the recalibration legislation. Were the consultants told, here's 21.9.101? I mean, we throw basket of goods around. I just want to know exactly what it means. Is it 29.9.101 and just that? Or is it also the Hathaway Success Curriculum and also the State Uniform Content and Performance Standards and also GATE? You see what I'm saying? All I want is a definition of what was asked for. Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, maybe we can just ask staff to get us that RFP. I'm sure somewhere in the bowels of our electronic files, we still have that, and I think that would be valuable for us to look at.
So, Mr. Chairman, to that point, for this recalibration, there was no RFP. This was a sole source contract. The 2017 recalibration, there was a RFP process that was utilized. Picus and Auden have been involved in the Wyoming education finance system and advised the consultants since 2005. They are very familiar with that Wyoming's educational program. And I think also, Dr. Picus was involved in the 2001 recalibration with MAP, and I think he can touch base on that as well. So when he comes up in the next few minutes, I think he can provide you some historical context to that and what they utilize in determining the cost. But they look at our statutory requirements, which have only changed minimally, on determining what the cost is.
Mr. Chairman, just another follow-up.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And this goes back to what I asked Josh earlier about what the courts accepted for our basket of goods or didn't accept. And so what I would ask of Josh is just a little primer on, was there anything in the court decisions that talked about the basket of goods and what wasn't as it relates to an adequate education. So I would like to hear that. Thank you.
All right, any other questions from recalibration? Senator Coe.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, the discussion on the success curriculum came about obviously when we adopted Hathaway. And my recollection, of course, the success curriculum requires a student to opt into a specific program in high school. and ninth grade, which is 4 years of English, math, social studies, and science for all 4 different criteria of Hathaway. So I wanted to make that point. I'm not aware that the consultants were specifically directed through the RFP or whatever it might be to cost out what that success curriculum was. And staff can correct me, but I think I'm right on that.
Any other questions for Mr. Wilmarth before I move on to the Joint Education Committee? Seeing none, questions from the Joint Education Committee of Mr. Wilmarth on this second half of his presentation? Anyone? All right, well, it looks like Matt, you've wound up your presentation, so we move at this time to public comment on Mr. Wilmarth's presentation on the Wyoming Education Program.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, we have one person. It's Brian Farmer. I'm going to admit him right now, so just give him a few seconds to join.
Okay, and Matt, I was asked about cloud recording. I thought it was my local drive was trying to record, and so I told it no, but I may have turned off inadvertently the recording on the YouTube broadcast. Can Karen take a look at that?
Yeah, I'll have Karen look at that. So, Mr. Chairman, Brian Farmer should be in the meeting and ready to testify.
All right, Brian, fire away.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brian Farmer, Wyoming School Boards Association. And I just want to take a brief moment to thank you as members of the Recalibration Committee. This is a tremendously important discussion that you're having, and it's a fair amount of time that you're all committing to this. A few years back, I remember at a prior recalibration, it was Representative Nicholas' brother that said, every legislator that comes to the legislature cares about education. Everybody in Wyoming cares about education, and I believe that. I believe that you are here because you care about Wyoming's kids, about Wyoming's future, that we really want the best for them. So this discussion that we have about the educational program, as you've had, is tremendously important because it is the first step. The discussion just had, specifically by Representative Summers, talking about the very first step in the process is to determine the basket. That's the very first step. And so I appreciate the thoughtful discussion that you've been having on this. I do want to let you know that the education community stands ready to assist you in this process. It's strange for us to not be in a room with you, to be able to have those side discussions, to be able to offer some additional information and answers, and certainly want to be available to you should you have any questions. Just by way of example, Senator Bebout, you asked a question about, do other states, or is there any other discussion about a right to education? And I'd love to visit about a case out of Michigan, ultimately settled, so it's not precedent, but a very interesting case about a federal right to literacy. It was settled in the Sixth Circuit, so it didn't move forward. But there are a number of other cases that talk about that. And we're happy to provide any kind of answers or insight that we might have on this matter. I did want to talk a little bit specifically about the educational program and tell you that the way that we kind of understand that is understanding the educational program being the first step. The second step is to cost it. The third step is to fund it. The fourth step is to deliver an educational program. And there are differing expectations of what that educational program in its delivery might be from its definition for funding purposes. So in your discussions about the Hathaway scholarship, the success curriculum, that's important. Representative Summers talks about how important that is because that is an expectation at the local level. Students expect the Hathaway Scholarship Program to be, the curriculum to be available to them. Parents expect that to be available. By way of difference, graduation requirements, there are 13 credits required. The Hathaway Success Curriculum requires 19 credits. Hathaway requires 4 years of English language arts, 4 years of math, 4 years of science, 3 of social studies, and 4 electives that include things like career technical education, fine and performing arts, and foreign language as options. So there certainly are differences between what a student or their parents might expect from the local school district as to what the funding system might build. And that's why we've oftentimes talked about a block grant and why block grants are important to local districts, because the block grant allows them to use the funding that's available to provide that quality expectation or that quality education that's expected by their community. I can tell you that I've worked with a number of communities in Wyoming as we've done, excuse me, as we've done strategic planning. We've met with a number of districts, and in the strategic planning process, we talk with different groups, those within the school and those within the community. And when the community tells us about what they expect of their educational system in these different places across the state, everybody says, yeah, we expect all of that, that basics, the core, the electives, those kinds of things, but we also expect things like perseverance. We expect grit. We expect problem-solving communication. We expect students to be collaborative. We expect them to communicate well. And they have those kinds of expectations of students. And so then the local district has to figure out, how are we going to deliver all of those things? How are we going to meet the Common Core of knowledge and skills? How are we going to meet the Hathaway Success Curriculum? How are we going to meet the expectations of students and parents? And I think the discussion you're having right now is so very important because it lays the foundation. And really, I would give great kudos to the LSO staff. I think they prepared you well. They gave you some very good resources today in the materials, both in talking about the history and also specifically taking a look at the work that was done in that 2017 study by Augenblick, where they looked very specifically at what do other states do. If we want to talk about a basket of goods, an educational program, so what do the states around us do? What do the states that are high performing do? And I think that's very, very informative to understand what do we want from our educational system in Wyoming. And so I really hope you do take some time to take a look at that 2017 study, to think about that work that was done, because it was extensive thought, extensive examination of what should be a part of the basket of goods. And really the reason that the basket, in terms of the statutory basket, has not changed over time is because every time we ask the question, what should it be, we come back with basically the same answer. We come up with the answer of what that Blue Ribbon Commission did in the late 1990s, largely what we see in statute today. Some change, the addition of computer science and computational thinking, but the place where the real change happens is in the standards. And I hope you heard Matt's discussion about the massive amount of change that has happened in standards. So to talk about math being a part of the basket of goods, to take a look, honest to goodness, if you could imagine walking into a school in your community and looking at one of those long hallways, and imagine a poster along one of those hallways, it would take a good 10-foot poster to list out all of the standards that exist for Wyoming's expectations of standards for those content standards. And as we add to that with understanding of what performance standards might be, that's a lot. And that change has happened over time, continues to happen, but that's really the work of education, is to continue to examine what's best for our students. just before meeting with you, I talked with my good friend Kevin Mitchell. Kevin's the executive director of the Superintendents Association, and he said, you know, Brian, one of the things that I used to say when I was superintendent, I used to tell my people in my district that when we make decisions thinking about adults, we get bogged down. But when we strip that out and we think about what's best for our kids, the decisions become a lot easier. And so I do think that is something to keep in mind when we talk about the expectations of education in Wyoming. If we keep in mind what's best for the kids of Wyoming, if we think about the education, the future that we're promising to them and that we're delivering to them, that's really what this discussion now is about. The expectation of the educational system in Wyoming is, what do we want to create over the 13-year educational career of our students? And I want to tell you, thank you. Wyoming's done a great job at that. Those of you that have been in the legislature for some time, I owe you a lot personally. My kids got a great education in Wyoming. My kids are very successful today because of a great system that we've built and a system that we should be proud of. We've done our kids well, and that's the discussion now moving forward. What is it that we want to provide to them into the future? So really just thank you for your work. Please know that education community is ready to work with you to offer you resources, information, and assistance. Anything we can do to help the conversation as we move along. I know that there have been some of you that have asked for data. We're happy to get that either through Matt or provide it to you directly. Let us know what we can do to help as we move through the process. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'd be happy to answer questions, but please know of our commitment to help you in this process.
Thank you for that commitment. Committee members, it's 20 after. That puts us 45 minutes behind our schedule before the Picus Nodden presentation. Any questions for Mr. Farmer? Senator Hicks.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Brian, thanks for being here today. I've got a question for you based on some of your conversations. When I went back and reviewed the Campbell 1 decision, one of the things that the court said is local control is not a constitutionally recognized interest. And you've stated you guys, your association supports the block model grant funding. But my specific question to you is why don't the districts follow the actual expenditures of the block grant model, and yet you support it? So there seems to be a dichotomy that you support the model, but districts then don't spend the money according to the way the model funds them. So what's the disparity, and how come districts are not following the model, yet you support the block granting model, funding model? Anyway.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, please, Mr. Farmer, proceed.
Thank you. Senator Hicks, I think that's a great question, and I think it does come to fundamentally what is the purpose of the model? Is it a funding model? Is it a spending model? Does it provide an avenue or a direct prescription to success? And I think throughout the history, certainly if you look back at the 1997, the work of MAP and their thought into creating prototypes and what would it take to fund education, it quickly became clear to folks in the process with MAP that really almost nobody fits a prototypical school. It's kind of the law of averages. How do you get something similar in Meeteetse that you can have in Cheyenne? So the model has to really provide for the delivery of the resource. And then the comment about local control over the spending, the answers to why is it different are as different as the districts are. And so you might find, for example, a district like Carbon County School District number 1 recognizes that it's very difficult to deliver education to Little Snake River Valley. that there's not an economy of scale. And so maybe you want to shift some funds that you generate from Rollins to Little Snake River Valley. Maybe you want to do that because that balances what works well in your community. I think in our larger school districts, you can talk about not having enough classrooms. In Cheyenne, why don't they have enough teachers? Because there are not enough buildings and enough classrooms to put enough teachers in. As Cheyenne has built new schools and added more classrooms, they've gotten closer to the model. One of the biggest differences, one of the biggest reasons is wages. When you look at the model significantly underfunds wages. Every time that we've looked at the consultants' recommendations, and when you look at Dr. Stoddard and her work on this, you'll see graphs. And those graphs are always based on what we pay, not on what the model funds. When you look at that, it's very, very necessary to look at what the model funds, not just what we pay. So when we look at what Wyoming pays, we find Wyoming is very competitive. If you look at what Wyoming funds, we're much lower on the list. So lots and lots of different answers, and I'd be happy to sit down and talk with you and go over them lines by lines, but that is a long discussion and not one that can be easily answered, other than to say local demand, local expectations are often for something different than what that prototypical model might provide.
Thank you, Mr. Farmer. Yes, Senator, oh wait, Senator Hicks, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, just follow up, and Brian, I think your analysis to a certain degree is accurate, but that's what drive the question to begin with let's illustrate wages. The model doesn't reflect wages whatsoever, so it begs to question the value of the model in my mind. Especially when we start looking at things like superintendent salaries that in the state of Wyoming, we pay 24% more than what the model would tell us is appropriate for a superintendent salary. Business managers, 23% more than the model. Teachers are around 10%. So what's the value of the model if it doesn't reflect what's actually going on wage-wise within our school system? So I question the value of doing the model if it doesn't reflect what's actually going on the ground. So I just a follow-up on that. I just wonder where we're going with this, and if based on your testimony, and it shows up in the data as you articulated, that we get the actual data, it doesn't reflect the model. So I'm just wondering if there isn't a better way to do the model that reflects what's actually going on the ground at the local level, and providing that additional flexibility, a plus or minus percentage within that to get to those local and regional variances. So just real quick, but I think you hit on my concern all along, is it doesn't represent what's going on the ground. So what is the value of the model then?
Mr. Farmer, and I'd ask, it's an important question, but could you be concise in your response? You've now been speaking for cumulatively 15 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'll give a very brief answer to that. Senator Hicks, the answer, and I believe Senator Coe would be able to tell you a lot about it, is in the 2015 recalibration. We went through the process and we were slugging our way through each piece of it. And then Senator Coe, as chairman, said, so are we going to, ever come to an agreement on this piece and that piece? Or do we agree that the bottom line is okay? And if the bottom line's okay, are we happy with the model? And everybody said, yeah, we're happy with the bottom line. And so we didn't calibrate the model. We said we're happy with the bottom line. Could we get there? Perhaps.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Senator Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Farmer, I think the point you were making regarding the differential between the model average salaries and the true average salaries, in my opinion, is critically important. And what I'd ask of you is perhaps for the next meeting, give us a one-pager that really lays out that analysis for us. I think it would be valuable to just see those differences, because it's hard, I think, for members of the legislature that aren't directly involved with this to really understand that when we're looking at ECAs, we're looking at ECAs relative to the real wages, whereas the model itself provides an entirely different set of wages. So would you prepare maybe a brief memo, just a one-pager or so, that kind of lays out that concept for us? Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rothfuss. So, Mr. Wilmarth, you got note of that? That's a request for follow-up, not from staff, but from Mr. Farmer. Senator Coe.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, just very briefly as well for Brian. And Brian, I appreciate all the work of you and I've worked closely over the years. Also, I'd like to, on the discussion of wages that I think Senator Rothfuss alluded to, I'd like to, in that memo, maybe give us an explanation why the model funds some 600 plus, I think it's 600 plus teachers that have never been hired. I think that's a really relevant point. At least I think I'm fairly close on that. It might be more than that, as a matter of fact, but if you'd include that as well, please.
Thank you. Representative Harshman.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. I think, this is kind of a larger discussion, and I think we're going to get some of this information tomorrow in the crew report, how resources are actually spent. I think you'll be surprised, frankly, how closely they align with the model. But I think it's a lot of parts to this. Remember, in 2017, we tried to right-size those 600 teachers with the salaries. Senator Cole, remember, and we tried to, we don't pay 1 penny for food service in the model. And we know it costs our districts about $30 million a year. And so those are, why hasn't food service been funded? Why haven't, the 12 security guards in Casper been funded? And so I think as we've given these local elected officials the opportunity to respond locally, so I think there's a lot to this. You can't, if you're going to look at all these pieces, look at what I call the ghosts you can't see. That's the 600 teachers. But I think you got to talk about the ghosts in the model that you can see. And that's kids who eat school lunch every day, or the security guards, or whatever, or salaries compared to those numbers of teachers. And that's the real salary. And how competitive is that? We know the model salaries way underfunded. And again, we went through this exercise in 2017. We never even made a motion on the bill, if members of that committee will remember, because it costs $70 million more. And so there's a lot. And again, I think a lot of this information, Mr. Co-Chairman and members, tomorrow in the crew report. Thank you.
All right, Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Just quickly, a request for Josh, and maybe he has this off the top of my head, off the top of his head, but I think one of the Campbell decisions actually talked about the block grant. So I'm curious if the Supreme Court opined on the block grant versus, everything costed out and paid for that way. That's one question I have. And the other, I think Speaker Harshman's right. We're going to get into this, and I think this will be a real agenda item in the future meetings. Is what should be in the block grant, what should not be in the block grant. Where do we want to emphasize? We've done that with other things, and other times there's been categorical exclusions for different pieces that the legislature felt we want to make sure the money spent on this. So we'll get into all that, and I hope that's an agenda item. But Josh, do you recall if the court ever opined on the block grant?
Mr. Chairman, I don't remember specifically. I mean, obviously in Campbell 4 and in Campbell 2, even the court recognized that the system we had adopted was a constitutional system. However, in Campbell 4, they did note that the court didn't and should not dictate the method of the education or the funding. So there are certainly other systems that could be constitutional systems. But I'll do a look to see if what they said, if anything, specifically regarding the block grant.
Thank you. Senator Hicks.
Mr. Chairman, just real quickly, just for the committee's edification, In the career report for 2018, 2019, there was 975 teachers in the model that are currently not, that are funded but are not employed.
Thank you. Anything else from the Senator Rothfuss?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just do want to reiterate, though, again, for the edification of the committee, that those are all underfunded positions, which is the reason why we end up with the ghost teachers. You can't go with one side of the equation and not the other, which was actually one of the conclusions that was taken to heart, I think, from the APA recalibration. You can't just look at one of those two numbers. You have to always consider the market salary at the same time as the number of teachers.
Thank you. Other questions from the recalibration committee before I go to the education committee? Anyone else? All right, I'll turn to the education committee. Have you got any questions for Mr. Farmer? Anyone? All right, well, that wraps up that portion of our program, of our agenda. The next portion of the agenda is the recalibration work plan. And that's Larry Pikus and Dr. Auden, Nate Levinson, Kathleen Hoyer. We have a noon break. It's now 11:30. I do have a hard stop at noon, so we'll get started, but we're going to have to break promptly at noon. We'll be back promptly at 1. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Pikus, Auden, Levinston, and Mulvaney. Welcome.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you very much. I'm Larry Pikus of Pikus, Auden and Associates. I'm going to share my screen. So we have some PowerPoint, Senator Coe, hello, to help us walk through this and pace our just talk today. I'm not sure exactly how far we'll get by noon. My goal would be to get a ways, at least to a place where we can stop logically and make some sense and respect your hard stop. What I'd like to add to the conversation that this took place is that I've actually had the privilege of being part of the recalibration for a very, very long time. There was reference to the very first 1997 RFP, and I actually submitted a proposal for that. There were 2 steps in that process, and I was qualified to submit a final proposal, and then actually combined with another firm. We were on the losing end of that. Later, I worked with MAP, the firm that actually won that first grant, or that first project, and then later built part of our earlier part of the model that's been in use. And then in 2005, we were the successful bidders. So, and I would say that a great deal of what I've learned about school finance in Wyoming has come from that experience, but also from the fact that for that entire period of time, I've had the privilege of working with Senator Coe and Representative Harshman. And so I've learned an immense amount about how these processes work and about school finance in Wyoming. But we've had the privilege to travel across the state many, many times and are really very, very pleased to be back here and talking to the committee today. What we'd like to do today, assuming I can get my PowerPoints to switch, we'll start with some brief introductions of the people who are working on it, who are here. I'll then lay out the outline of our work plan so that it's clear how this entire recalibration will proceed. I'll then provide, Alan and I will give you a detailed description of the evidence-based model. And what we want to do is also talk about the major components of the study, which include our review of the evidence-based elements, a large and new study on special education. That's the work of the district management group. And Nate Levinson will be conducting that conversation along with Simone Carpenter. We'll then provide some discussion of the case studies that we have conducted in 10 schools across the state, and also give you a brief description of how we're working on what we call professional judgment panels. We're doing 18 of those panels. We've completed 4 as of today. And then I'll bring you up to date on where things stand on a variety of other analyses around the ECA, the RCA, the salary analysis that Professor Stoddard is doing. And obviously the end of this becomes a final report to the select committee by the end of this year. I'm Larry Pikus. I've been in Wyoming working in Wyoming for a very, very long time, and have always enjoyed the opportunities. I'm also in my other day job I'm a professor at the University of Southern California School of Education and currently the Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Affairs there. I'm going to let Alan introduce himself, and then I'll mention briefly some of our other folks and then turn it over to some of the others.
Hi, I'm Alan Odden. I'm a professor emeritus from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I've been working on school finance for probably 30 years. Larry and I have been working together doing state adequacy studies for at least 20 years. I'm very happy to be involved in this particular study, which I think is going to be the most comprehensive one. And I look forward to the time when Larry and I and the rest of the team can be in Wyoming and see you personally. But I have enjoyed meeting you virtually and listening to the conversation this morning, which I found very good and fascinating.
Okay. In addition, people who work directly with us include Scott Price, who's a former student of mine and currently a superintendent in the Los Angeles area. He's an expert and has been working for years and years in the areas around technology, which have become a particularly important concern, even more than we thought it would be when we started this project. The other three names on your screen, Taylor, Akua, and Sarah, are PhD students at the University of Southern California, and they all work with us. This is an evidence-based model, so we are using them to help us ensure that we're finding the most current research on many of these topics. I'm going to turn this over to Nate and Simone to introduce themselves and the district management group.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. My name is Nate Levinson. I'm the managing director with the district management group. Very excited to meet you all, at least virtually. The district management group is leading the special education portion of the work. I'll give you a bit more of my background when we get to that, but briefly, I have been over the last decade or so working with about 200 school districts across the country on the intersection of how do you serve students with special needs and how do you do that cost effectively. I've written a number of books on the topic. We've done quite a bit of work in small and rural districts as well. So we are new to Wyoming, but not at all new to the types of schools and school districts you've got. Prior to that, I was a school superintendent, also 6 years as a school board member, and worked in the private sector prior to that. I'm very excited to be with you today and through this process. And my colleague Simone, who's been very much on the ground in the state through this work when we're allowed to do that. Simone, if you'd jump in and briefly introduce yourself.
Hi, good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm Simone Carpenter from District Management Group. And just a quick introduction of myself. As Nate said, I've been very much on the ground in Wyoming when possible and doing some of the day-to-day project management of this work. I started my career as a middle school math interventionist. I started in the classroom working directly with students and then decided to leave the classroom and went and worked in education research for some time, working with states and national departments of education to do large-scale program evaluations. And then I made my way to district management group about 3 years ago. And over the last 3 years, I've worked with over 50 school districts and 3 or 4 statewide efforts to do similar work to understand how to best use limited resources to serve students, especially students with disabilities in schools, districts, and states. I'm excited to be here and will say more about the work in a little bit.
We also have partnered for this recalibration with a firm called Activate Research. Kathleen Hoyer is here today, and I'm going to let Kathleen introduce herself and then talk briefly about Activate Research and their role.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, members of the committee, Mr. Chair. I'm here speaking on behalf of several colleagues at Activate Research, as you see on your screen, to talk a little bit about our role in the work, and you'll hear more about what we've done on the case studies later today. But as by way of introduction, Activate Research is a small women-owned social science research firm based out of Washington, D.C. We do qualitative, quantitative research as well as technical assistance. On this particular project, we have four people working. I am working alongside Kim Curtis to do some of our data collection. We have not, unfortunately, been on the ground given COVID, but we've been able to do several data collection opportunities virtually with educators across the state, and that has been extremely rewarding. Kim and I have backgrounds in both in qualitative and quantitative research, and we have done many studies of school finance, some of which have been partners with Larry and Alan in other states. And on this project, we are doing the same. We are working on the case studies and the professional judgment panels, which Larry will speak of in more detail later. We also are getting senior level advice and project management from our founder and president of Activate, Dinah Sparks. And our data collection manager, Ty Ali, is working with us to make sure that all of the moving pieces of all of this, all of this work are going well. So we have been coordinating with hundreds of educators across the state, both for the case studies and for the professional judgment panels. And Ty has been managing all of that to make sure that communications go out on time, that everyone who's supposed to be invited gets invited, and that the logistics work smoothly.
Thank you, Kathleen. We have one other partner on our team. It's a firm called District Leadership Solutions. The partners in DLS are all former school superintendents, mostly from the Midwest. Donald Schulman is the person we've worked with the most closely, as well as Kathy Burkett and Diane Rutledge. And they've been advising us on many of the issues that surround how we think about the central office issues and a number of the issues and concerns that come up around things. So we've tried to build a team that addresses all of the issues in the element and give us access to information and people who will help us build each of these pieces and address each of the elements of the evidence-based model. I'd like to talk briefly about the work plan, and then I think we'll stop for questions and see how that gets us to our hard stop at noon in Wyoming. So the first question is, what is recalibration? And I think that as we've talked about the court rulings in Campbell, one of the great pieces of wisdom that the court in its first Campbell ruling came up with was the requirement that the Wyoming system be recalibrated at least once every 5 years. And that makes to me a great deal of sense, because what we know about education, how children learn, what we learn about how children learn, and all those things changes over time. And so that becomes an important part of keep making sure that the model and the funding model stays consistent with current education practices. Specifically, the idea of recalibration is to determine the estimated cost of the educational program, which is the basket of goods and services set forth in Wyoming law. And to answer the question that we talked about prior to our starting about what were consultants given, is I believe Senator Kinski's question, we've generally basket of educational goods, and that's been our general approach to how we look at it. We look more detail, obviously, the Hathaway program and the parts of that, as well as we've looked at the various assessments that have been used in the past, so that we know that we're providing enough resources that teachers are able to impart the knowledge that's expected for the state of Wyoming. But it's largely focused around the basket of goods and services. And this year we have the new components of the basket that include computing and computer knowledge. The evidence-based approach is there are in the general literature on the basic question of adequacy, or how much money do you need in a state or in a school district. There are 4 general approaches. The evidence-based approach is one that was developed by Alan Odden and me over the course of many years of working together. He was once a professor at USC and recruited me there. So we've actually worked together for over 30 years as professors, and we worked together in a number of ways prior to that. And he even was kind enough to provide some financial support for my dissertation longer ago than either of us will admit. The evidence-based approach looks at current research in education and applies that to the resources that you would need to design a school to ensure that all students have the opportunity to meet the state's performance standards. It's easier said than done, and as those of you who've worked with us over the many years know, it's not an exacting science. There are lots of variation in things. The evidence-based approach is, as far as we know, still the most widely used approach to estimating adequacy across the 50 states. We've worked in about 25 or 30 states using this method in one way or another. Wyoming has been our longest and most consistent partner. We used this process 2005 and in the recalibrations of 2010, 2015, and we'll use it again in 2020. The topic of the APA studies already come up, as you've talked about what that study provided. And we've obviously had access to that study, have read it. And the principles of APA are people we're well acquainted with. The school finance community is a very small one, and we are all friends and colleagues and work together on a frequent basis and certainly know what we're all working on and doing. This particular recalibration has several components. First, we are reviewing all of the components of the current block grant model. I believe it was Senator Coe mentioned some 37 elements. I think we're approaching now more like 40 by the time we include pre-K and school safety and items that we may not have had in some earlier ones. But we look at each of those elements. We'll provide you with a report that will show you what, if there were recommendations in 2015 of the current legislative model. That is, our evidence-based model represents what we see as the evidence and the resources you would need to provide adequate programs for children. The legislature has sometimes appropriated or implemented somewhat differences or variations to that. In the early days, when it exceeded what was in the model, when they went to court, they referred to it as legislative grace. And certainly, I've said this since the very first meeting we had with the very first committee we worked with in Gillette in 2005. We would tell you what adequacy is. It's never anything you'll hear me say is that you're spending too much on the children of the state of Wyoming. That would be a legislative decision, and we certainly wouldn't tell you you've spent too much. In this model, in addition to reviewing those components, as Kathleen mentioned, we're doing case studies in 10 improving schools to see how their work matches the components of the evidence-based model. She'll describe that study in detail later today. We're conducting 18 professional judgment panels. They also are being done virtually. I realize we're going to miss the chance to drive around the state and meet with people personally and carry on these professional judgment panels, but we've completed 4 so far, and I think they're going quite well and will be very successful in helping us understand the concerns on the ground of educators in Wyoming. There is a separate and extensive study of special education. District Management Group, Nate and Simone, are conducting that. So when I speak and when I talk, I'm just leaving out special education and leaving them to talk about what they're finding on special education, as that study's a very big and important component of the entire overall study. And then we will submit to you all a final report. This, Mr. Chair, was where I was going to stop and first ask for questions. If there are any, we're happy to answer them. And if not, at your direction, we can proceed forward until I will leave that to you, sir.
Let's go ahead and open it up for questions. We'll get started and then break at noon. Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, Dr. Pikus, thanks for joining us and providing this analysis. You said that you base your report on adequacy. And so how do you define adequacy? How does that relate to what we discuss as adequacy with relationship to our Supreme Court cases and constitutional mandates?
Mr. Chair, Representative Summers, thank you very much for that question. I think that our intent is that the two are completely aligned. That is, our view of adequacy is to provide you with a model that describes the resources that are needed so that all of the children in the state have a reasonable or likely ability to meet the state standards that you've established. And then it's the basket of educational goods and services that actually implement students' performance, the resources for students to reach those goals and to learn it. And so I would say that adequacy means, adequacy means enough resources so that all children can meet those standards. Adequacy is sometimes an unfortunate word. It's really a way to provide standards so that you could provide enough resources so that children can meet world-class standards and succeed in with the proper job skills or the ability to go on to higher education. Alan may want to add something to that.
That's good.
Okay.
Other committee members? Other members of the Recalibration Committee, any questions? Senator Bebout. And then Senator Hicks.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of questions. You mentioned there are 4 models, and you know the evidence-based model is the one we've used for the last 3 or 4 times we've done this. You know, if we really take a broad look at what our charge is on Recal, what are the other 3 models? You can supply this to us later. I'd like to see what they are and the use of them or the non-use of them, or what they are not. The other thing that comes to mind is if we stick with the evidence-based model, and I'm not sure where the committee is going to go, but if we decide to do that, or if we need to make that decision, when you look at the other 3, how do you start the evidence-based model if you don't have a discussion about the basket of the goods? And Mr. Co-Chair brought that up. Co-Chair Summers brought that up. So don't we need to know what the basket of goods is going to look like before we start having the evidence-based model, even if we go with that model? Thank you.
Mr. Chair, Senator Bebout, of the other 3 models that we spoke about, the APA study actually used 2 of those models in its study in 2017. That's the successful school and district model and the professional judgment model. The 4th model is a statistical model known as a cost function. It's a model that does a detailed statistical analysis at the district level, and 48 districts probably is too small a sample size to actually get an accurate model to work in the state of Wyoming. So that's the reason it's not been used, or we've recommended not using it in the past. The APA study has a description of all of these models in it, and we'll be certain, obviously, to include in the initial chapter of our report a brief discussion of each of the other 3 models as well. We've always used the evidence-based model in our work. We've done a couple of studies early on where we included some of the other studies. We've actually partnered with some other individuals, notably APA and other states, to do studies that included all of those. But this model is purely focused on the evidence-based model and designed to provide a full basis for that. And in terms of the basket of educational goods and services, that's where we start. We look at that basket, we say, what does this basket need? The core of the idea is, what are all the things you need in this basket to achieve the standards that have been established? Identify what each of those components are: teachers, school leaders, district leaders, and then determine the cost of each of those items and sum that up to get a total for every school, for every district, and across the entire state.
Senator Hicks, you were next, right after Senator Bebout.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Larry, question for you. Representative Summer had asked a little bit about the discussion on the adequacy. And in your answer, you talked about the evidence-based model as a cost-based model, but you also talked about student performance and student success. So how do you analyze the effectiveness or the efficacy of the funding model against student performance and student success? Where does that come into play in the cost analysis?
Mr. Chair, Senator Hicks, one of the challenges in all of this is finding a direct, consistent, and strong statistical link between simply dollar resources and student outcomes is, if you will, the holy grail of school finance. And it's still an aspirational sort of a thing. It's not something that we can actually produce right now. So what we really look at are providing enough resources to allow schools to implement strategies that have been shown to be successful in a relatively short period of time, making dramatic improvements in student outcomes as measured through a variety of assessments. This also does require, and there are resources in the model to do this, that the individuals who work in schools, teachers, coaches, school leaders, and the people who support them in the central office all have the skills and are well trained to be able to do this as well. So now we're talking about 12,000 people who work in the schools in the state of Wyoming. I think that's the right number, but I don't have it at the tip of my fingertips. That they're all well qualified and always able to do all of these things. So I wish I could promise you just do everything we say in the model and every kid will score at the top of the tests. That hasn't happened in the last 15 years. I don't know that this recalibration will change that directly. We have a new testing system in Wyoming, so it's going to create some challenges in following student performance improvements. We've looked at the NAEP tests, which is a national test. Wyoming has generally done reasonably well. I don't think you've made very large performance gains in those tests in the last 15 years. There's been some, but not a great deal. Is that right, Alan?
We'll see tomorrow.
Okay. Well, we will see what the state tells us as well.
If I could add to Larry's comments in terms of this link between the elements of the model and performance, I think it's best to interpret the EB model as a model that suggests that if you have these resources, schools should be able to produce large improvements in student performance on state tests over a 3 to 5 to 6 to 7 year time period. And one of the reasons that we're doing the case studies is we wanted to find out if there were schools in Wyoming producing significant improvements in learning. And we wanted to look at what they did and to look at whether or not that aligns with the elements that are in the funding model. So it's really large improvements towards the ultimate goal of having all or almost all of your students performing at or above your proficiency standard levels.
So with that, it's noon. We'll pick up again with questions for Picus and Auden at 1. Senator Rothfuss?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Very briefly, I just wanted to correct the record a little bit there regarding the NAEP scores. We will go over those tomorrow, but Wyoming's in the top 5 or 10 in every category at this point in 4th and 8th grade reading and math. That's tremendous. And I want to make sure anybody watching understands that.
All right, super. We'll stand in recess until 1 p.m. sharp.